My name is Sydney, 27 years old, and for 10 straight years I quietly paid every single bill for my ungrateful family while they treated me like the dirt on their designer shoes. It all ended last Thursday with a 30-second video clip my Aunt Brenda sent me by accident. I was sitting at my desk in the damp, windowless basement. I was forced to call my bedroom, doing what my family firmly believed was cheap minimum wage data entry work. My phone vibrated loudly against the wood with a text notification. It was a large video attachment. When I tapped the screen and hit play, I was instantly greeted by the sparkling blue waters of Miami, Florida. My family had rented a massive multi-level luxury yacht for the weekend, a yacht that I paid for. My older sister Vanessa and her husband Terrence were lounging on the pristine white leather deck chairs, soaking up the sun. Terrence, my African-American brother-in-law, who always loved to flaunt the wealth he never actually earned, was wearing a $5,000 imported silk shirt. He raised a crystal champagne flute toward the camera, a massive grin on his face. "Sydney is a pathetic failure." Terrence laughed, his deep voice carrying over the sound of the ocean waves and the expensive boat engine. "She is 27 years old and hiding in the basement doing data entry like a total loser. She should be grateful we even let her breathe our air." Then my mother, Patricia, leaned into the frame, casually adjusting her diamond-studded designer sunglasses. "She is a massive leech on the family trust," my mother sneered, taking a sip of her expensive cocktail. "If it were up to me, I would have thrown her out into the street years ago. She brings absolutely nothing to this family but embarrassment." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to quietly cut off toxic family members who completely underestimated your worth. You will definitely want to hear how I legally destroyed their fake empire overnight. I did not cry when the video ended. I did not scream, and I did not throw my phone across the room. I simply smiled, opened my laptop, and navigated directly to the elite corporate client portal of Apex Wealth Management. Growing up, my family was practically destitute, drowning in terrible debt. What they did not know was that when I was exactly 17 years old, I developed and sold a revolutionary data compression algorithm to a massive global tech conglomerate for $14 million. Because I knew my parents were extremely financially irresponsible and would drain my accounts in a month, I had my corporate lawyers set up an anonymous, ironclad blind trust. We told my greedy family the money came from a distant great-uncle who had passed away overseas. For an entire decade, they lived like royalty, assuming the trust was an endless magical well of free cash. They were completely oblivious that their pathetic failure of a daughter was the sole benefactor pulling all the strings from the basement. I clicked into the active accounts dashboard, my fingers flying across the keyboard. First, I found the Miami Yacht Rental Company. They had a daily pre-authorization hold for the vessel. I hit cancel immediately. Next, I opened the financial file for the main house. The sprawling 5-bedroom colonial estate they lived in upstairs, the very same one where they banished me to the concrete basement, had a massive monthly mortgage. I canceled the auto pay without hesitation. I moved on to my sister Vanessa next. She had 3 platinum credit cards tied directly to the trust fund. I flagged all of them as stolen and permanently froze the accounts. Finally, I looked at Terrence. My loud, arrogant brother-in-law drove a luxury imported SUV that cost more than most hardworking people make in 5 full years. I terminated his commercial lease agreement and revoked the banking payment authorization. It took me less than 3 minutes to completely dismantle their entire fraudulent reality. I closed my laptop, took a deep breath, and waited. 2 hours later, my phone buzzed violently. It was a furious, poorly typed text message from my mother. "We are coming home early," she wrote. "The stupid yacht company made a ridiculous billing error and forced us off the boat right in the middle of our vacation. Make sure the entire house is spotless when we get back." I read the message, set my phone face down on my desk, and prepared for the incoming storm. By midnight, the heavy oak front door slammed open so hard the living room walls actually shook. Heavy footsteps stomped directly toward the basement door. Terrence kicked my door open, His expensive designer suit wrinkled, and his face twisted in pure, unadulterated rage. Vanessa and my parents crowded into the small room right behind him. My father, Richard, marched straight up to my desk and slammed a thick stack of legal papers right over my computer keyboard. "It is time you finally pull your weight in this house," Richard shouted, his face turning red with anger. "The trust account managers are suddenly claiming there is a massive deficit. Our premium cards are declining everywhere in the city. Since you live under our roof, you are going to start contributing immediately." I looked down at the paperwork he threw at me. It was a formal residential lease agreement. They wanted to charge me $1,500 a month just to live in my own unfinished, freezing basement. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly, glaring at me like I was a convicted criminal. "You have been draining our family inheritance for far too long, Sydney." She snapped, her voice dripping with venom. "You are going to sign that lease right now, or you can pack your trash bags and sleep on the cold concrete street tonight." Terrence leaned over my desk, towering over me to be as intimidating as possible. He aggressively tapped his expensive gold watch. "You have exactly 5 seconds, little girl. Sign it or get out of my house." They expected me to beg for mercy. They fully expected me to cry and plead with them to let me stay. Instead, I calmly reached for a black pen. I put on my best terrified face, deliberately letting my hands shake just a little bit to perfectly sell the performance. I signed my name at the bottom of the lease agreement and handed the thick packet back to my father. "Fine," I whispered, keeping my eyes cast down toward the floor. "I will pay it." My mother snatched the paper from his hands, looking completely victorious. "You better have the first payment transferred by tomorrow morning." She scoffed loudly before turning on her heel and marching back upstairs. The rest of them quickly followed, laughing cruelly and whispering to each other about how incredibly easy it was to put me in my place. I sat perfectly still and listened to their heavy footsteps fade away into the upper levels of the house. And then, in the silence of my basement, I let out a genuine, satisfied laugh. They truly thought they had just trapped me and squeezed me for their desperate need for cash. But what they did not understand was basic real estate law. By forcing me to sign a formal binding residential lease agreement, they had just legally granted me absolute tenant rights. They could no longer kick me out on a whim. And even better, they had just made my father legally liable as my official landlord. They had absolutely no idea they just handed me the exact legal weapon I needed to destroy them all. I woke up the next morning feeling more powerful than I had in a decade. The very first thing I did was scan the signed lease agreement into my encrypted cloud drive. In the state we lived in, a signed residential lease without a notarized cancellation clause meant my father was legally bound to provide a habitable living space. By law, he could not shut off my electricity, he could not change the locks, and he certainly could not evict me without a formal 90-day court order. I immediately logged into my dummy bank account, the one I used for my fake freelance data entry job, and scheduled a certified electronic transfer of $1,500. I did not send it to my father directly. Instead, I routed the payment to Apex Property Management, a corporate entity that I secretly owned. This generated a legally binding rent receipt. The trap was now fully locked. I walked upstairs to the kitchen to grab a cup of coffee. My mother Patricia and my sister Vanessa were sitting at the large marble island sipping expensive imported lattes. They looked at me with identical expressions of smug superiority. Vanessa sneered and looked me up and down. "It is about time you finally pull your weight around here," she said, stirring her drink slowly. "You have been draining our inheritance for years while doing absolutely nothing with your life. You should be thanking Dad for not charging you double." I kept my face perfectly blank, poured my black coffee, and simply nodded. I wanted them to feel absolutely invincible. I wanted their arrogance to reach its absolute peak before I pulled the rug completely out from under them. The real fallout from my financial blockade began later that exact same evening. Terrence had scheduled a massive client dinner at a premium downtown steakhouse. As a flashy real estate agent who specialized in selling overpriced properties he could never afford himself, Terrence relied heavily on projecting an image of endless wealth. He was trying to secure a massive commission from a wealthy commercial developer, and he needed to put on a show. According to the furious voicemail the restaurant manager left on the Family Trust contact line, later that night Terrence went completely overboard. He ordered 3 massive dry-aged tomahawk steaks, imported caviar, and 2 bottles of a vintage reserve wine that cost over $1,000 each. When the dinner concluded, Terrence casually flagged down the waiter. With a practiced, arrogant flick of his wrist, he tossed down the heavy metal black credit card tied directly to the family trust. The same trust I had permanently frozen less than 24 hours ago. He leaned back in his leather chair, smiling smugly at his wealthy client, completely oblivious to the ticking time bomb he had just activated. 5 minutes later, the waiter returned to the table. He was holding the black card on a small silver tray, looking incredibly nervous. "I am terribly sorry, sir," the waiter whispered, trying to be discreet. "But this card has been declined." Terrence instantly lost his mind. He slammed his fist down on the table, causing the expensive crystal wine glasses to rattle. "Run it again!" Terrence shouted, dropping all pretense of being a refined gentleman. "Do you have any idea who my family is? That is an unlimited premium account. Your cheap machine is obviously broken." The commotion drew the attention of the entire dining room. The general manager quickly hurried over to the table to intervene. "Sir, I assure you our machines are working perfectly," the manager said firmly but politely. "The issuing bank has completely frozen this account. The primary account holder placed a hard stop on all transactions. Do you have another form of payment for the $3,400 bill?" Terrence patted his tailored suit pockets, his face turning a sickening shade of pale gray. His personal bank accounts were constantly overdrawn because he spent every dime he earned on luxury car leases and designer clothes. He had absolutely no backup plan. His wealthy client sat across the table watching the entire humiliating spectacle with a look of pure disgust. The developer silently stood up, grabbed his coat, and walked out of the restaurant without saying a single word. Terrence just lost the biggest commission of his entire career. "Sir," the manager said, his voice dropping to a cold, serious tone, "if you cannot settle this bill right now, I will be forced to call the police for theft of services." Panicking and desperate to avoid being arrested in a room full of local elites, Terrence was forced to unclasp his beloved solid gold Rolex watch from his wrist. It was his most prized possession, a symbol of the fake status he worshipped. He handed it over to the manager as physical collateral, promising to return the next morning with the cash. Terrence drove home in a state of blind, destructive rage. At exactly 11 at night, I heard his heavy footsteps thunder down the basement stairs. He kicked my door so hard the wood splintered around the lock. He stormed into my room, pointing a trembling finger right at my face. "You pathetic little thief," he screamed, his veins popping out of his neck. I slowly took off my headphones and looked up from my computer screen. "Is there a problem?" I asked calmly. "Do not play dumb with me," Terrence spat, pacing around my small room like a caged animal. "Someone stole the black card details today and triggered a fraud alert. My card got declined at the most important dinner of my life. I know it was you. You probably tried to buy some cheap garbage computer parts online because you are too broke to afford anything nice." I stared at him, marveling at his absolute delusion. Even in the face of a massive financial crisis, his ego simply could not comprehend that the endless well of money had dried up. He genuinely believed his pathetic data entry sister had committed credit card fraud rather than accept the reality that the trust was empty. "I did not touch your card, Terrence," I replied smoothly. "Maybe the trust managers finally realized you spend way too much money on expensive wine." He lunged forward and slammed both hands down on my desk. "I will get my watch back tomorrow, and then I am going to make sure Richard throws you out on the street, lease or no lease," he threatened. "You are nothing but a parasite." Terrence stormed out of the basement, slamming the broken door behind him. I picked up my phone and opened the banking app again. I navigated to the secondary credit lines and noticed my mother had just tried to use her card to buy a $500 pair of shoes online. Declined. The dominoes were finally starting to fall, and they were all going to crash directly onto their heads. The very next morning brought a new wave of panic to the household. I was quietly sitting at the small dining table in my basement, organizing my digital files, when I heard a loud shriek echo from the main entryway upstairs. My mother, Patricia, had just opened the Daily Mail. I walked up the stairs and stood in the hallway watching the chaos unfold. She was holding a thick piece of crisp white paper, her hands visibly trembling. "Richard, get in here right now!" she yelled, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. My father rushed out of his home office still wearing his silk bathrobe. Patricia shoved the paper into his chest. It was a certified legal notice from the exclusive Neighborhood Homeowners Association. The community we lived in was notoriously strict and aggressively monitored the wealth and status of its residents. The letter stated in bold red ink that the household was delinquent on $5,000 worth of annual association dues. If the balance was not paid in full within 48 hours, the board would officially place a public lien on the property and publish the delinquency in the neighborhood newsletter. For a woman like my mother who lived entirely for the approval of her wealthy country club friends, public humiliation was a fate far worse than death. "How is this possible?" Richard muttered, his face turning a sickly shade of white. "The trust always auto-pays these fees on the first of the month." "Because the trust is currently restructuring, you idiot," Patricia snapped at him. "The bank said it could take weeks to unfreeze the primary accounts. We do not have $5,000 in liquid cash sitting around. Terrence spent his last dime on that ridiculous dinner last night, and Vanessa is maxed out." That was when they both slowly turned their heads and looked directly at me. I was standing near the kitchen island holding a glass of water. A predatory gleam sparked in my mother's eyes. She marched over to me, invading my personal space. "Sydney," she demanded using her sweetest, most manipulative tone of voice, "you need to help your family." I took a slow sip of my water. "I just paid you $1,500 in rent yesterday," I replied calmly. "You should use that money to pay the association." My father scoffed loudly and threw his hands up in the air. "We cannot touch that money yet," he complained angrily. "The new lease agreement you signed routed the payment through some ridiculous third-party property management portal called Apex Holdings. They placed a standard 7-day clearing hold on the funds. We need cash right this exact second." Patricia slammed her hand on the marble counter. "You have a job, Sydney. You have been doing that pathetic data entry work for years. Go down to one of those payday loan places in the city and take out a cash advance." I stared at her, genuinely amazed by her absolute lack of shame. "You want me to take out a high-interest predatory loan to pay your luxury neighborhood fees?" I asked, keeping my voice completely monotone. "I cannot do that. My credit score is terrible, and my income is too low to qualify for a $5,000 unsecured loan." Patricia's fake sweet tone instantly vanished, replaced by a vicious scowl. "You ungrateful little brat," she screamed, pointing her manicured finger an inch from my nose. "We put a roof over your head. We feed you. We allow you to live in this beautiful house, and this is how you repay us. You are completely useless." She wildly looked around the kitchen counter and spotted my car keys sitting near the fruit bowl. I drove a beat-up 10-year-old Honda Civic. It was the perfect disguise for my fake low-income lifestyle. Patricia lunged forward and snatched the keys off the counter, gripping them tightly in her fist. "Since you refuse to contribute to this family, I am taking collateral," she announced triumphantly. "You do not get to use this car anymore. I am going to call a broker and sell this piece of junk to a used car lot today. It might fetch a few $1,000s, which is more than you have ever been worth to us." Richard nodded in agreement, completely supporting her unhinged behavior. "That is a great idea, Patricia," he said, glaring at me. "You can walk to the grocery store from now on, Sydney. Maybe some fresh air will cure your selfish attitude." They stood there, chest puffed out, fully expecting me to break down in tears and beg for my keys back. The old Sydney would have panicked. The old Sydney would have desperately tried to find a way to fix their problems to win their conditional love. But the woman standing in front of them now was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar private equity firm. I simply shrugged my shoulders. "Okay," I said quietly. "If you think that will solve your problems, go ahead." I turned my back on them, walked straight to the front door, and pulled out my phone to order a premium rideshare service. As I waited on the front porch, I opened my corporate management app. What my mother did not know was that my beat-up Honda Civic was heavily modified. It was equipped with a state-of-the-art, hidden GPS tracking system. Furthermore, earlier that week, I had officially transferred the title and registration of that specific vehicle into the name of my corporate entity, Apex Wealth Management. It was no longer my personal property. It was a registered commercial company vehicle. By taking my keys and planning to sell the car without authorization, my mother had just crossed the line from being a toxic parent to committing felony grand theft auto. I could have called the police right then and there. I could have watched them put her in handcuffs on the pristine green lawn. But I decided to wait. I wanted her to try and sell it first. I wanted the used car dealership to run the vehicle identification number and flag it as stolen commercial property. I climbed into the back of my waiting car, watching my mother peer out the living room window with a smug, victorious smile on her face. She truly believed she had just won the battle, completely unaware that she had just eagerly walked right into a federal trap. As my driver pulled away from the house, I received an automated email notification from the trust management software. Terrence had just attempted to log into the emergency family portal. The system had locked him out, but it triggered a security protocol that would soon lead to the biggest mistake of his entire life. The chaos was only just beginning. I sat comfortably in a private booth at a quiet downtown coffee shop, sipping a latte and watching the live security feed from the hidden camera I had installed in my basement room. The camera was small, disguised as a standard phone charger plugged into the wall, but it gave me a crystal-clear view of my desk. I knew Terrence was getting desperate. The 24-hour deadline to retrieve his solid gold Rolex watch from the steakhouse manager was rapidly approaching. Without that watch, his entire fake persona of being a highly successful real estate broker would completely shatter. He needed cash, and he needed it immediately. On my phone screen, I watched the heavy basement door swing open. Terrence crept down the wooden stairs, looking over his shoulder like a common burglar in his own home. He was sweating profusely, his expensive dress shirt wrinkled and untucked. He frantically rummaged through my desk drawers, tossing my cheap pens and notebooks onto the floor. When he found absolutely no cash, his eyes locked onto my laptop sitting on the desk. It was an older model, the exact computer I used to maintain my disguise as a low-wage data entry clerk. Terrence grabbed it, his eyes darting around the room one last time before he sprinted back upstairs. He had absolutely no idea that I had intentionally left that specific laptop behind. I had even disabled the password lock on the main user account. It was a digital mousetrap, and Terrence had just taken the cheese. I switched tabs on my phone, logging into the remote desktop monitoring software I had secretly installed on that machine. I could see exactly what Terrence was looking at in real time. He took the laptop into the upstairs kitchen, slamming it down onto the marble island. Vanessa, Richard, and Patricia gathered around him, their faces tight with anxiety and greed. "What are you doing, Terrence?" Vanessa asked, her voice high and panicked. "You cannot pawn her stupid computer. It is probably worth $200 at most. That will not even cover the interest on the neighborhood association fee, let alone get your watch back. Shut up and let me work." Terrence snapped his fingers, hammering away at the trackpad. "I am going to wipe the hard drive and take it to the electronics buyer on 5th Street. Every dollar counts right now." But as he tried to navigate to the system settings to perform a factory reset, he noticed a single brightly colored PDF document sitting right in the center of the desktop screen. It was titled, "Apex Wealth Management Tier 2 Emergency Fund Access." I watched through the remote feed as Terrence stopped completely still. His cursor hovered over the file icon. Slowly, he double-clicked it. The document opened to display a highly official-looking legal contract, complete with authentic bank seals and complex financial jargon. At the very top, highlighted in bold black ink, were the words, "Primary Beneficiary Sydney." The document explicitly detailed an emergency reserve fund tied to the original family trust, designed to be accessed only in catastrophic financial situations. Terrence let out a loud, breathless gasp. "Look at this," he shouted, pointing violently at the screen. "I knew it. I absolutely knew it. That sneaky little rat has been hiding money from us this entire time." Richard leaned in closer, squinting to read the fine print. His face turned bright red with sudden outrage. "It says right here that the Tier 2 fund is completely separate from the primary accounts. It was established by the great-uncle as a failsafe. Sydney is the only authorized signer. She has been hoarding a secret emergency stash while we are up here drowning in debt." Patricia clutched this pearl necklace at her throat, acting as though she had just been physically struck. "I cannot believe the ultimate betrayal," she gasped dramatically. "We put a roof over her head, and she secretly hoards family money while my poor Terence is forced to surrender his jewelry to a rude restaurant manager. She is a selfish, ungrateful monster." Vanessa slammed her fist against the counter. "How much is in there?" she demanded. "Does it say the balance?" Terence scrolled frantically down the page. "It does not list the exact balance, but look at the tiered authorization limits. It says the primary signer can authorize instant wire transfers of up to $250,000. This is huge. This could pay off the house, get my watch back, and cover the down payment on the new Porsche I wanted to buy." The pure, unfiltered greed radiating from them was almost suffocating. They did not question why I would have a secret fund. They did not feel guilty for breaking into my room and stealing my belongings. All they saw was a brand new pile of money, and they immediately felt entitled to every single penny of it. "We need to get into this account right now," Terence said, his voice shaking with adrenaline. "But she is the only authorized signer. The bank will not let us touch it without her signature on a formal power of attorney. We will just make her sign it." Richard growled, crossing his arms over his chest. "She signed the lease agreement when we pressured her yesterday. She is weak. She always folds when we push her hard enough." "No," Patricia interrupted, a wicked, calculated smile spreading across her face. "Sydney is getting rebellious. Did you see how she just walked out and called a car when I took her keys? If we just aggressively demand the money, she might try to lock us out. We need to play this smart. We need to manipulate her emotions. We need her to willingly hand over the power of attorney." "What are you thinking?" Vanessa asked, looking at her mother with eager anticipation. Patricia smoothed down her expensive silk blouse. "Sydney has always been a pathetic, soft-hearted fool when it comes to family emergencies. I am going to suddenly fall very ill. I will say my heart is failing due to the extreme stress of our financial ruin. We will tell her the doctors are demanding an immediate cash deposit for a life-saving surgery, and the primary trust is frozen. We will beg her to sign the emergency access over to Terence so he can handle the hospital bills." "It is brilliant," Terence laughed, slapping Richard on the shoulder. "She will be crying so hard she will not even read the paperwork. I will draft the power of attorney form right now." I sat in the coffee shop listening to their entire wicked plot through the hidden microphone on the laptop. They thought they were being absolute geniuses. They thought they were about to execute the perfect heist to steal my secret fortune, but they were completely blind to the reality of the situation. That document was completely real. Apex Wealth Management did exist, but the Tier 2 emergency fund was not a magical pile of cash. It was a dummy corporate shell account that I had specifically engineered to hold a massive amount of toxic, defaulting commercial debt from a failed real estate venture. Whoever signed as the authorized operator of that specific fund would instantly become legally and personally liable for millions of dollars in toxic loans. I took a slow, satisfied sip of my latte. They wanted a power of attorney. I was more than happy to give it to them. I stayed at the coffee shop for another 2 hours, deliberately giving them more than enough time to fully orchestrate their pathetic little theatrical performance. I wanted them to stew in their own anxious greed, planning every single detail of their manipulation. When I finally ordered a premium rideshare to take me back to the suburban estate, the sun was just beginning to set, casting long and dark shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns of the wealthy neighborhood. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked slowly up the pristine concrete driveway. Before I even turned the heavy brass handle of the front door, I could hear the faint, highly exaggerated sounds of moaning coming from the main living room. I pushed the door open and stepped inside the grand foyer, instantly met with a scene straight out of a terrible daytime soap opera. My mother, Patricia, was lying completely flat on the expensive white leather sofa, a cold washcloth dramatically draped across her forehead. Her eyes were squeezed tightly shut, and she was letting out weak, breathy sighs, as if every breath was a massive struggle. My father, Richard, was kneeling right beside her on the rug, holding her hand, with a look of manufactured devastation painted perfectly on his face. Vanessa was pacing back and forth across the room, biting her nails, while Terence stood rigidly near the stone fireplace, clutching a thick stack of freshly printed legal papers in his hands. "Sydney," Richard called out loudly, his voice intentionally cracking with fake emotion, the absolute second he saw me enter the room. "Thank goodness you are finally home. We have an absolute medical emergency. Your mother collapsed to the floor shortly after you left the house today." I dropped my canvas bag by the front door and rushed over to the living room, forcing my eyes to go wide with perfectly feigned panic. "What happened?" I asked, letting my voice tremble and waver just enough to completely sell the act. "Why is she on the couch? Should I call an ambulance right now?" "No," Patricia wheezed pitifully, her manicured hand weakly reaching out to grab my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong and sharp for a woman supposedly experiencing complete heart failure. "The ambulance will just take me to the crowded public county hospital. You know the doctors there are completely incompetent and the wait times are endless. I desperately need to go to the private cardiac clinic downtown, but they require a massive cash deposit up front before they will even admit me through the doors." Richard looked up at me, his eyes pleading and wide. "Her heart is completely giving out, Sydney. The terrible stress of the neighborhood association threatening to take our family home today was just too much for her delicate system to bear. The private clinic needs $50,000 immediately, but the family trust is completely frozen by the bank. We have absolutely no way to save her life." This was the exact moment of truth. Vanessa stopped her anxious pacing and stepped much closer to me, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "We were so incredibly desperate to find a way to pay for her urgent medical care that Terrence went down to your basement room to see if you had any emergency cash stashed away." She lied smoothly, not breaking eye contact with me for a single second. "He opened up your laptop and he found something massive. Sydney. He found the Tier 2 emergency fund document." Terrence stepped forward, confidently waving the papers he had printed from my computer right in my face. He tried his best to look solemn and responsible, but the greedy, hungry glint in his dark eyes completely betrayed his true intentions. "We know all about the secret reserve account the great-uncle left you," Terrence said, using a deep and serious tone. "We know you are the only authorized signer on the account. We are not angry that you selfishly hid it from us, Sydney. We just need you to do the right thing right now. Your mother is actively dying on this couch." I looked down at Patricia, who let out another pathetic, agonizing groan to heavily emphasize the point. The manipulation was so incredibly transparent, it was almost insulting to my intelligence, but I played right into their greedy hands. I let my shoulders slump forward in defeat. I forced a few genuine tears to well up in the corners of my eyes, an old survival trick I learned from years of having to hide my true emotions in this extremely toxic house. "I cannot believe you actually broke into my private room and went through my personal computer," I whispered softly, letting a single tear fall down my cheek. "That fund was supposed to be my absolute last resort for my future. If I drain it now, what will happen to me?" Vanessa scoffed loudly, her fake sisterly sympathy instantly evaporating into harsh, unfiltered cruelty. "Your future. Your mother is lying right here dying in front of you, and you are only worried about your own pathetic future. You are the most selfish and disgusting person I have ever met in my entire life." Terrence shoved the heavy stack of papers directly into my chest, aggressively forcing me to take them. "This is a standard legal power of attorney form," he explained quickly, his words rushing out in an eager and desperate torrent. "It grants me as the head of the household temporary authorization to act completely on your behalf regarding the Tier 2 fund. If you sign this paper right now, I can personally wire the money directly to the private clinic and get your mother the life-saving surgery she desperately needs. If you do not sign it, her immediate death is going to be entirely on your hands. I stared down at the paperwork in my hands. It was a standard cheap legal template he had clearly downloaded for free off the internet. The blank spaces for the account numbers had been hastily filled in with the routing information from the dummy corporate shell I left open on the screen. He was so incredibly blinded by the prospect of unlimited cash that he had not bothered to hire a real lawyer to review the complex corporate structure of the account he was trying to legally access. "Please," Sidney Richard begged pitifully, squeezing his eyes shut to force out a fake tear. "Save your mother." I let out a loud, dramatic sob that echoed through the large room. I slowly took the black pen Terence was forcefully holding out to me. My hands shook violently as I pressed the tip of the pen to the signature line. I hesitated for one final second, looking around the room at the terrible people who had made my entire existence a miserable, suffocating prison. They were watching the pen, like starving wolves watching a piece of raw meat. I signed my full legal name at the bottom of the page. The shift in the energy of the room was absolutely instantaneous. Terence literally snatched the paper out of my hands before the black ink was even fully dry. A massive, victorious grin broke out across his face, showing all his teeth. He looked directly at Vanessa and nodded sharply. "We got it," he announced loudly, completely dropping the somber, respectful medical emergency act. On the leather couch, Patricia miraculously stopped moaning. The supposedly dying woman sat up perfectly straight, casually removing the cold washcloth from her forehead and tossing it onto the glass coffee table. She let out a long, satisfied exhale and gracefully adjusted her expensive silk blouse. "Well," she said briskly, her voice entirely back to its normal arrogant tone. "That was entirely too exhausting for me. I am going to need a large glass of expensive wine to recover from all this ridiculous stress." I stood there pretending to look completely shocked and utterly betrayed. "You are not sick at all," I whispered loudly, taking a stumbling step backward. "You all completely lied to me." "Oh, please grow up, Sidney." Vanessa laughed cruelly, walking over to pour her mother a drink from the crystal bar cart. "We did exactly what we had to do to protect the family assets from your selfish hoarding. You had absolutely no right hiding that money from us anyway. Terence is going to manage the funds from now on." Terence was already carefully folding the power of attorney document and stuffing it deep into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. "I am going to the bank first thing tomorrow morning to validate this document," he said, practically vibrating with excitement and greed. "And once the funds are fully cleared, I am finally going to get my gold watch back. And then I am going straight to the luxury dealership. That new Porsche Cayenne is practically already sitting in my driveway." Richard proudly patted Terence on the back, looking exactly like a proud father admiring his successful son. "Good work, son. This family is finally back on track. Now, Sidney, go back down to your basement right now. We have very important financial planning to discuss, and it absolutely does not concern you." I turned around and slowly walked out of the living room, keeping my head bowed down in complete mock defeat. Behind me, I could hear the sharp sound of crystal glasses clinking together as they loudly celebrated their brilliant deception. They truly thought they had just secured millions of dollars in free cash. They thought they had finally broken me completely. But as I walked down the wooden stairs to my dark basement, a genuine terrifying smile spread across my face. Terence was taking a legally binding power of attorney document to the bank tomorrow. He was going to officially attach his own name, his social security number, and his personal financial liability to a corporate shell account, holding $800,000 of defaulting commercial real estate debt. The trap was permanently sprung, and they had eagerly locked themselves inside. The very next morning, the house was buzzing with an electric, greedy energy. I could hear Terence upstairs practically whistling as he paced back and forth across the hardwood floors. The rich scent of his overpowering designer cologne drifted down the basement stairs. He was putting on his best custom-tailored suit, preparing for what he believed was going to be the most triumphant day of his entire life. Vanessa was right beside him, excitedly discussing which high-end boutiques they were going to visit the absolute second the bank gave them access to my secret millions. I sat quietly at my desk, sipping my morning tea and watching the digital dashboard of my corporate wealth management software. At exactly 9 in the morning, Terrence and Vanessa marched into the grand lobby of the primary downtown branch of the Citibank. I could trace their movements through the digital access requests pinging my secure server. Terrence proudly slammed the power of attorney document onto the desk of a junior branch manager. He demanded immediate access to the Tier 2 emergency fund, loudly claiming he was the new authorized head of the household estate. The junior manager, unaware of the complex corporate trap I had set, scanned the document into the system. Within 20 minutes, the bank's automated legal software verified Terrence's identity. It officially linked his social security number and his personal financial profile to the dummy corporate shell account. My phone buzzed with a confirmation email. Terrence was now legally listed as the primary guarantor of an $800,000 toxic commercial real estate debt portfolio. But Terrence did not know how to read complex financial statements. When the bank manager turned the computer screen around to show him the account overview, Terrence only saw the bold numbers. He saw a corporate credit facility limit of $800,000. He completely ignored the glaring red text that clearly labeled it as a revolving liability line. In his arrogant, uneducated mind, he had just gained access to an unlimited black card. "Let us go shopping," Terrence announced to Vanessa, his voice echoing through the quiet bank lobby. They did not go to the hospital to pay for my mother's supposedly life-saving surgery. They did not pay the neighborhood association fees. Instead, my digital tracker showed them driving straight to the most exclusive European luxury car dealership in the city. Terrence had been obsessing over a brand new fully loaded Porsche Cayenne for months. He strutted onto the showroom floor like he owned the entire building, immediately demanding the attention of the senior sales director. Through the financial authorization requests pinging my phone, I watched the entire transaction unfold in real time. Terrence confidently handed over the corporate account information and his newly validated power of attorney. He was securing financing for a $130,000 vehicle. The dealership ran the corporate entity, saw the massive available credit facility, and eagerly drew up the paperwork. Terrence eagerly signed his name on every single dotted line, completely legally binding himself to the massive auto loan, using the toxic shell company as his financial backing. By 2 in the afternoon, a loud, aggressive car horn blared in our driveway. I walked upstairs and stood on the front porch. Terrence and Vanessa had just pulled up in a gleaming silver Porsche Cayenne with completely tinted windows and custom black rims. Richard and Patricia rushed out of the front door, completely abandoning any lingering pretense of my mother being deathly ill. Patricia practically skipped across the pristine lawn, running her hands lovingly over the smooth paint of the luxury SUV. "Oh, Terrence, it is absolutely gorgeous!" Patricia squealed with delight, pulling him into a massive hug. "You are an absolute financial genius. You saved our family." Terrence leaned against the hood of the expensive car, adjusting his designer sunglasses with a smug, arrogant smirk. He looked over at me, standing quietly on the porch. The expression on his face was one of pure, unfiltered triumph. "I told you I would unlock that trust, Sydney," he sneered, pointing a finger at me. "You thought you could hide the great-uncle's money from us. You thought you could keep all of this wealth to yourself while you hide in the basement like a pathetic rat. Well, I am the captain of this ship now." Vanessa stepped out of the passenger side, her arms completely loaded with expensive shopping bags from designer boutiques. She walked right up the steps and got entirely too close to my face. "We have the power now," she whispered cruelly. "As soon as the final paperwork clears on the estate restructuring, we are tearing up your stupid lease agreement. We are going to legally evict you by the end of the month. You better start packing your cheap clothes right now." I looked at the shiny new car, then at my completely cured mother, and finally at my arrogant brother-in-law. I forced myself to look terrified, taking a small, fearful step backward. "You cannot do this," I whispered, keeping my voice weak. "That was my emergency money." "It is our money now." Richard laughed, patting the roof of the Porsche. "Go back to your basement, Sydney. We have celebrating to do." They all piled into the spacious, luxurious interior of the new vehicle, loudly discussing which five-star restaurant they were going to drive to for a celebratory late lunch. I turned around and walked back inside the house. I did not go to the basement. I stood in the kitchen, pulled out my encrypted phone, and sent a direct, secured message to my primary wealth manager at the shadow bank I controlled. Approve the Porsche auto loan under the Tier 2 Shell Corporation, I typed quickly. Set the variable interest rate to the absolute legal maximum of 22%. Lock the loan terms immediately. My phone buzzed almost instantly with a reply. Done. The first massive payment will be due in exactly 14 days. I smiled and put the phone in my pocket. Terrence thought he had just won the lottery. He had absolutely no idea he had just purchased a $130,000 anchor that was going to drag him straight to the bottom of the ocean. And to make matters even better, because they had spent their afternoon buying luxury cars and designer clothes, instead of paying the urgent utility bills, the city was officially scheduling a total power shutoff for the main house. The dark reality of their incredible greed was about to hit them very hard. Later that evening, long after the sun had fully set, I heard the heavy, aggressive roar of the brand-new Porsche engine as it pulled back into the driveway. They had spent the last 6 hours at a 5-star waterfront restaurant downtown, racking up another massive bill on whatever scraps of credit Terrence still had left, fully believing that the Tier 2 fund would simply absorb the entire cost by the next morning. I could hear them stumbling heavily through the front door, their voices loud and slurred from expensive champagne. They left the front door wide open for several minutes just so the neighbors could see the gleaming silver luxury SUV parked illegally on the front lawn. The basement door swung open violently, crashing hard against the drywall. Vanessa walked slowly down the wooden stairs, gripping the handrail tightly to steady herself. She was wearing a brand new, highly expensive designer cocktail dress that still had the security tag lightly clipped to the inside hem. She held a crystal glass filled with champagne in one hand and a sleek leather designer handbag in the other. She walked right up to my small desk, looking down at me with an expression of absolute disgust mixed with total victory. Terrence is an absolute financial genius. Vanessa gloated, her words slightly slurred but dripping with toxic venom. He went right into that bank and unlocked the entire trust without breaking a sweat. The branch manager practically bowed to him when he saw the massive numbers in that account. We have millions at our disposal now, and you cannot do a single thing to stop us. I looked up from my computer screen, keeping my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not say a word, letting her fill the quiet room with her own staggering arrogance. You thought you were so incredibly smart, Vanessa sneered, taking a long, sloppy sip of her drink. You thought you could keep all that wealth to yourself while the rest of us suffered and worried about bills. Well, the tables have completely turned. My husband is the official head of the estate now. And since we clearly do not need your pathetic basement rent money anymore, we are going to legally evict you next month. You have exactly 30 days to pack up your cheap garbage and get out of our house. I forced my bottom lip to tremble, looking down at the floor as if I had been entirely defeated. Where am I supposed to go? I whispered, making my voice sound small and terrified. I do not have any money saved up to afford a real apartment. That sounds like a personal problem. Vanessa laughed cruelly, turning around to walk back up the stairs. You better start looking for a local homeless shelter. Or maybe you can sleep in the back seat of your ugly Honda. As soon as the heavy door clicked shut behind her, my fake tears instantly vanished. I picked up my encrypted phone and read over the confirmation message I had received earlier from my wealth manager. I had specifically instructed him to approve the Porsche loan through our shadow banking division and lock the interest rate at the absolute legal maximum of 22%. But there was another devastating layer to the trap that Vanessa and Terrence were completely oblivious to. The shadow bank I owned specialized in extremely high-risk predatory lending for wealthy clients with terrible credit histories. When Terrence eagerly signed the financing paperwork at the luxury dealership, his massive ego prevented him from reading the dense pages of legal fine print. The 22% interest rate compounded daily, not annually. Furthermore, the contract included a catastrophic default clause. If Terrence missed a single payment, or if the backing corporate shell account was ever audited for fraud, the entire balance of the loan would immediately become due in full. And because he signed the power of attorney linking his own social security number directly to the toxic debt, my bank had the absolute legal right to aggressively garnish his real estate commissions and seize any personal property he owned. They were literally upstairs celebrating their own financial execution. They had eagerly traded a minor cash flow problem for an inescapable mountain of toxic high-interest corporate debt. The next morning, the house was completely quiet. The heavy hangover from their massive celebration had clearly set in. I walked upstairs to the kitchen to make myself some breakfast. Patricia was sitting at the large marble island, wearing her silk bathrobe, looking incredibly pale and exhausted. She was nursing a cup of black coffee and staring blankly at a thick stack of mail that had been delivered the previous afternoon. Right on the very top of the pile was a large envelope with a bright red warning label printed boldly across the front. It was from the city utility department. I recognized the envelope immediately because I used to pay it every single month. It was the final non-negotiable disconnection notice, because they had chosen to spend their entire afternoons securing a luxury car and buying designer clothes instead of paying their extremely overdue electricity and water bills. The city was officially revoking their service. Patricia slowly pushed the envelope across the counter toward Richard, who had just walked into the kitchen rubbing his temples. "We need to have Terrence wire the money for the electric bill today," Patricia mumbled, her voice lacking its usual sharp edge. "The letter says they are sending a technician to shut off the power by 3 o'clock this afternoon." Richard waved his hand dismissively, not even bothering to look at the urgent final notice. "Relax, Patricia," he grumbled, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Terrence has the permanent power of attorney now. He will just call the bank manager and have them expedite a wire transfer directly to the utility company. We have an $800,000 credit line. A past due electric bill is absolutely nothing to us now." I stood by the stainless steel refrigerator, quietly pouring myself a glass of orange juice. They truly believed that the Tier 2 fund was a standard checking account they could just pull liquid cash out of to pay their daily household expenses. They had absolutely no idea that the toxic corporate shell account was strictly restricted. It could only be used to secure commercial asset financing like a predatory auto loan, but it could never be used to withdraw cash or pay residential utility bills. The money they thought they had was a complete mirage. "I am going to head down to my office," I said quietly, placing my glass in the sink. "I have a lot of data entry work to finish today." Richard scoffed loudly, leaning against the counter. "You do that, Sydney. Keep typing away for your minimum wage pennies while the adults handle the real money. Just remember, you only have 30 days left before you are out on the street." I nodded respectfully and walked back down to my basement. As soon as I reached my desk, I pulled up the digital tenant portal for the property management company I owned. When I signed the residential lease agreement my father forced upon me a few days ago, I did not just secure my legal right to live in the house. I also used the lease to officially register my basement as a completely separate independent dwelling unit with the City Housing Authority. That single piece of paper allowed me to schedule a private contractor to install a separate utility meter specifically for my basement, entirely disconnected from the main house grid. I had already paid my independent utility account in full for the next 12 months. While my arrogant family was busy ignoring final warning notices and bragging about their fake wealth, they were actively counting down the final hours before their entire glamorous world went completely dark. At exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy hum of the central air conditioning unit suddenly ground to a violent halt. I was sitting at my basement desk, perfectly comfortable, when I heard the sharp collective gasp echo from the kitchen upstairs. The sudden silence in the massive house was almost deafening. The only sound left was the rapid, high-pitched beeping of the expensive smart refrigerator completely shutting down. I glanced at the digital clock on my computer screen. The city utility department was incredibly punctual. I leaned back in my chair and listened to the immediate chaotic panic unfolding directly above me. Patricia was practically screaming. Her expensive hairstyling tools had died right in the middle of her afternoon blowout, leaving her trapped in the dark upstairs bathroom. Terrence was loudly shouting from the front entryway, violently rattling the handles of the massive electronic security gates. The gates were hardwired into the house grid and had automatically locked shut when the power failed, effectively trapping his brand new Porsche in the driveway. Richard was loudly slamming the refrigerator door open and shut, repeatedly cursing, as if the aggressive physical motion would somehow magically summon the electricity back to life. Then came the realization about the water. Vanessa shrieked from the guest bathroom that the faucets were completely dry and the toilets would not flush. Heavy, frantic footsteps stomped rapidly toward the basement door. Richard pulled the door open, fully prepared to yell at me to go check the breaker box in the utility closet. But the moment the heavy door swung wide open, his angry shouting caught in his throat. He completely froze. The wooden stairwell leading down to my room was pitch black, but at the bottom of the steps, my living space was glowing with bright, warm light. The soft, steady purr of my personal window air conditioning unit filled the air, keeping my room crisp and cool, while the oppressive afternoon heat was already beginning to bake the upper levels of the house. Richard slowly walked down the wooden steps, his eyes wide with absolute confusion. He squinted against the bright lights of my ceiling fixtures. "How do you have power?" he demanded, looking around my small room as if he were trying to spot a hidden generator. "The entire neighborhood block must be out. Did a transformer blow down the street?" I shook my head and pointed a finger toward my illuminated computer monitors. "The neighborhood grid is perfectly fine," I replied calmly, not bothering to stand up. "The city shut off your specific connection because you completely ignored the final warning notice this morning. I have power because I am a legally registered tenant. When you aggressively forced me to sign that residential lease agreement last week, I immediately used that legally binding document to apply for an independent utility meter specifically for this basement unit. My electricity and water bills are fully paid in advance for the next 12 months. You are currently standing in a completely separate, legally recognized residence." His face contorted with pure, unfiltered rage. The realization that I had outsmarted him hit him like a physical blow. "You selfish little brat." Richard spat his face, turning an angry shade of purple. "We have thousands of dollars of premium imported seafood and organic meats in the upstairs freezer. It is 100 degrees outside today. We are going to lose absolutely everything in that kitchen." He did not ask for my help. He did not apologize for his previous cruelty or for threatening to throw me out on the street. His staggering sense of entitlement simply took over. He quickly turned around, stormed back up the dark wooden stairs, and returned less than a minute later, holding a massive, thick orange construction extension cord. "Move out of the way," Richard ordered, violently pushing past my chair. He aggressively jammed one end of the thick orange cord into the wall outlet right next to my desk. He started unspooling the heavy wire in a rush, intending to run it all the way up the wooden stairs to power the main kitchen appliances and the living room fans. I could hear Patricia and Vanessa cheering him on from the top of the dark stairwell, loudly praising him for taking control of the situation and putting me back in my place. I sat quietly and watched him unravel the cord for a few seconds. I let him feel the temporary rush of victory. Then I calmly reached into my top desk drawer and pulled out a pair of heavy-duty industrial steel scissors. I stood up from my chair and walked right over to the wall outlet. Richard was already halfway up the wooden stairs, pulling the heavy orange cord taut against the banister. I did not raise my voice. I did not show even a single ounce of anger. I simply clamped the sharp, heavy steel blades completely around the thick orange wire and squeezed down with all of my strength. A loud, sharp snap echoed through the quiet room. The severed end of the extension cord dropped lifelessly onto the basement carpet. Richard whipped around so fast he nearly lost his balance on the dark steps. His face went completely pale with absolute shock, staring at the severed wire dangling uselessly from his hand. "What did you just do?" he screamed, his voice cracking with total hysteria. "Are you insane? You just ruined a $50 industrial cord." "I am simply protecting my legal liability as a registered tenant," I stated clearly, looking him dead in the eye without blinking. Running a high-voltage construction cord up a dry wooden stairwell to power major kitchen appliances is a severe violation of the city fire code. If that cheap cord overheats and burns this massive house down to the ground, my renter insurance policy will absolutely not cover the structural damages. As your paying tenant, I simply cannot allow you to create a massive fire hazard inside my legally rented space. I pointed to the severed piece of wire still plugged into my wall. Please remove your garbage from my floor, I added coldly. Richard looked like he was about to physically explode. He stood frozen on the stairs, his fists clenched tight, his entire body shaking with a level of furious anger I had never witnessed from him before. For my entire life, he had relied on shouting and intimidation to force me into total submission. But the rules of the game had completely changed overnight. I was no longer the frightened, desperate daughter he could easily bully into obedience. I was an independent legal tenant, armed with an ironclad lease, and he was nothing but a desperate broke landlord sweating in the dark. "I am calling the police right now," Richard threatened, his voice dropping to a dangerous, shaking whisper. "I am going to have the cops drag you out of here in handcuffs for vandalism and intentional property damage. You are going to rot in a jail cell tonight." I smiled sweetly at him and gestured openly toward the stairs. "Go right ahead," I told him, keeping my tone perfectly pleasant. "Let us see exactly what the local police have to say about this." Richard did exactly that. He turned around and stomped heavily up the wooden stairs, his heavy footsteps echoing through the dark, sweltering house. I listened as he marched straight into the kitchen and aggressively dialed the emergency number on his cell phone. He did not just call the police to report a simple family disagreement. He completely fabricated a wild, dramatic story to ensure they would respond immediately. Through the ceiling, I could hear him shouting into the receiver, frantically claiming that a violent, unruly squatter had broken into his luxury property, was actively destroying the electrical infrastructure, and was threatening the physical safety of his wife and daughters. I did not panic. I simply opened my desk drawer and pulled out a clean manila folder. Inside, I neatly arranged the original copy of the residential lease agreement that Richard had forced me to sign, a printed copy of the cleared rent payment receipt from my corporate portal, and the official confirmation letter from the City Housing Authority recognizing my basement as a completely separate utility zone. I placed the folder on my desk, sat back in my cool, air-conditioned room, and waited. Less than 10 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of two police cruisers reflected through the small ground-level windows of my basement. Heavy boots pounded up the concrete driveway. Terrence swung the front door open before the officers could even knock. He immediately started loudly complaining about how I had aggressively attacked Richard with a weapon, trying his absolute best to frame my use of the scissors as an attempted assault rather than property defense. I heard the heavy, authoritative footsteps of the two police officers entering the main hallway. Richard immediately began leading them toward the basement door, his voice loud and incredibly self-righteous. "She is down here," officers, Richard announced, practically vibrating with triumphant energy. "She severed a live wire and threatened me. You need to drag her out of my house immediately and press maximum charges for property damage and trespassing." The basement door opened, and the two uniformed officers carefully descended the wooden stairs, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. Richard trailed closely behind them, a massive, vicious grin plastered across his sweaty face. But when the officers reached the bottom of the stairs, they did not find a violent, unhinged squatter. They found me sitting calmly at my desk, dressed in neat business casual attire, surrounded by professional computer equipment, in a perfectly clean, brightly lit room. "Good afternoon, officers," I said politely, keeping my hands entirely visible on top of my desk. "How can I help you today?" The older officer looked around the pristine room, visibly confused by the massive contrast between Richard's frantic 911 call and the calm reality in front of him. "Miss, the property owner upstairs claims you are illegally squatting in this residence and just destroyed a piece of construction equipment with a weapon," the officer said, his tone cautious but professional. I let out a soft, respectful sigh and picked up the manila folder. "I am absolutely not a squatter, officer," I replied, handing the open folder directly to him. "I am a legally registered paying tenant. That man standing behind you is my landlord. He forced me to sign that binding residential lease agreement just last week." The officer looked down at the paperwork. He examined the lease, checking the dates and the signatures. He flipped to the second page and reviewed the official bank receipt proving that my rent had been paid in full. Finally, he looked at the city housing document authorizing my independent utility meter. "Is this your legal signature on this lease agreement, sir?" the officer asked, turning around to face Richard. Richard swallowed hard, his triumphant grin instantly melting into a look of panicked realization. "Well, yes. But she is my daughter." He stammered, his voice losing all of its previous confidence. "This is a family matter. We just wanted her to contribute to the household expenses, but she cut my extension cord." The younger officer stepped forward, his expression hardening. "Wait a minute," the officer interjected sharply. "Are the utilities currently disconnected in the main upper levels of this house?" "Yes," Richard admitted, sweat pouring down his forehead in the suffocating heat of the stairwell. "The city shut us off this afternoon. I was just trying to run a cord down here to borrow some of her power for our refrigerators. She used steel scissors to destroy my property." The older officer handed the folder back to me and turned his entire body to face Richard. His demeanor shifted from a polite investigator to a stern enforcer of the law. "Sir, this young woman is your legal paying tenant. You signed a binding contract granting her exclusive rights to this living space. Attempting to force a high-voltage cord into her private unit to steal electricity without her permission is entirely illegal. Furthermore, attempting to forcibly remove a paying tenant from a property without a formal 90-day court-ordered eviction is a severe violation of state housing laws." "But it is my house!" Richard yelled, his face turning bright red with humiliation and anger. "She is destroying my property. She severed a dangerous wire that you illegally introduced into her rented space." The younger officer corrected him firmly. "That is not assault, and it is not vandalism. That is a civil dispute. But what you are doing right now borders on criminal harassment." The officers did not stop there. They firmly grabbed Richard by the arm and escorted him up the dark stairs, demanding that he step outside to cool down and formally close the police report. I quietly followed them up to the main floor and stood safely inside the screen door, watching the incredible scene unfold on the front lawn. The late afternoon sun was beating down on the neighborhood. Because the power was out on the entire block of massive estates, almost all of our extremely wealthy, gossip-hungry neighbors were sitting out on their front porches or watering their pristine lawns to escape the indoor heat. They all had a perfect, unobstructed view of Richard standing in his driveway, sweating profusely in his silk robe, being loudly and aggressively reprimanded by two uniformed police officers. Mrs. Higgins, the incredibly strict president of the neighborhood association, who had sent the lien threat earlier that week, was literally standing at the edge of her driveway with her arms crossed, watching Richard with an expression of absolute disgust. "If we get called back to this residence because you are harassing your legal tenant or attempting an illegal self-help eviction, you will be leaving this property in handcuffs tonight," the older officer warned Richard loudly, ensuring his voice carried across the quiet suburban street. "Do you completely understand me, sir?" Richard looked around at his wealthy neighbors staring at him. His pristine, carefully manufactured image of being a highly successful elite patriarch was completely shattering right in front of his eyes. He slowly nodded his head, completely humiliated and defeated. "Yes, officer," he mumbled, looking down at his expensive slippers. The police officers got back into their cruisers and drove away, leaving Richard standing alone on the driveway. Terrence, Vanessa, and Patricia were huddled in the dark, suffocatingly hot living room, completely silent. They were finally realizing the massive, terrible mistake they had made. They had legally locked me into the house, and I was now untouchable. I smiled at Richard through the screen door, turned around, and walked back down to my perfectly chilled basement. The heat upstairs was going to be absolutely unbearable tonight, but they had not seen anything yet. The financial poison from the luxury car loan was already working its way through their system, and the real nightmare was scheduled to arrive exactly at midnight. Exactly 2 weeks passed in a state of absolute suffocating tension. The power to the upper levels of the house remained completely disconnected because the dummy corporate shell account simply did not possess the ability to wire cash to a utility company. My family was forced to rely on a loud, incredibly obnoxious gas generator they rented on Richard's final maxed-out credit card just to keep the refrigerators running and a few fans blowing. But the heat and the darkness were absolutely nothing compared to the financial execution that was rapidly approaching. When Terrence secured that luxury auto loan, he completely ignored the catastrophic default clause hidden in the fine print. The 22% interest rate compounded daily. When his very first scheduled payment officially posted to the account, the minimum amount due was completely astronomical. Because the Tier 2 fund was a toxic liability shell and not a liquid cash account, the automated payment was immediately rejected for insufficient funds. The second that payment bounced, the shadow bank initiated an immediate aggressive asset recovery protocol. They did not send a polite warning letter. They did not call his cell phone to ask for a new payment method. They simply dispatched the recovery agents. At exactly 2 in the morning, the heavy rumbling sound of massive diesel engines shattered the quiet peace of our exclusive suburban neighborhood. I was awake in my basement tracking the GPS coordinates of the recovery team on my encrypted laptop. I walked over to my ground-level window and peered out through the blinds. Two massive, heavy-duty tow trucks slowly backed into our wide concrete driveway. Their bright amber warning lights flashed rhythmically, casting eerie yellow shadows across the pristine front lawn and illuminating the dark, powerless exterior of the main house. The repo men were absolute professionals. They moved with incredible speed and precision. One agent hopped out of the first truck and immediately backed up to the gleaming silver Porsche Cayenne that Terrence loved more than anything in the world. The second agent maneuvered his truck toward the expensive imported SUV that Terrence had leased months ago, an account that had also inevitably fallen into severe delinquency now that the family trust was entirely frozen. The loud mechanical whine of the hydraulic lifts lowering into place echoed through the silent street. The noise finally woke Terrence. The heavy oak front door violently swung open. Terrence practically flew out of the house, sprinting down the brick front steps wearing absolutely nothing but a pair of designer silk boxers. He was completely barefoot, his eyes wide with wild, unfiltered panic. "Hey!" he screamed at the top of his lungs, his deep voice cracking with hysteria. "Get your filthy hands off my cars! What do you think you are doing? You cannot take those!" The lead recovery agent did not even flinch. He calmly finished securing the heavy steel chains around the front axle of the Porsche. "Sir, step back away from the vehicle," the agent ordered, firmly holding up a thick clipboard. "This property is being legally repossessed by the financial institution due to a massive breach of contract and severe payment delinquency." Terrence completely lost his mind. His massive ego, already severely bruised by living in a dark, sweltering house for 2 weeks, finally snapped. "I am the authorized head of the estate," Terrence roared, charging across the wet grass. "I have an $800,000 corporate credit line. I will sue you and your entire garbage company into the ground." He did not stop at yelling. Terrence lunged forward and forcefully shoved the recovery agent hard in the chest, attempting to physically unhook the thick steel chains from the undercarriage of his beloved luxury vehicle. The agent stumbled backward but immediately pulled a radio from his belt. Because repossession in wealthy neighborhoods often turned violent, when entitled people lost their expensive toys, the recovery agency had already notified the local precinct before they even turned onto our street. Within seconds of Terrence throwing that first physical punch, the loud wail of police sirens pierced the night air. 2 police cruisers sped around the corner, their red and blue lights completely flooding our front yard. Vanessa came running out of the front door a moment later wearing a thin silk nightgown. She let out a piercing, dramatic wail as she saw 2 police officers aggressively tackle her husband onto the damp grass. Terrence thrashed and cursed, fighting against the officers as they forcefully pulled his arms behind his back and locked heavy metal handcuffs around his wrists. "Stop it!" Vanessa shrieked, running down the driveway and waving her arms frantically. "You are making a terrible mistake. We are wealthy. My husband is a highly successful real estate broker. He has millions in the bank. You cannot treat us like common criminals." The officers completely ignored her frantic screaming. They hauled Terrence to his feet. He was covered in mud and grass, shivering in the cool night air in nothing but his underwear, completely stripped of his fake professional dignity. They shoved him into the back of the police cruiser, slamming the heavy door shut and trapping his furious screaming inside. I watched the entire spectacle unfold from the comfort of my air-conditioned basement, feeling a deep, profound sense of justice. But the absolute best part of the night did not involve Terrence or Vanessa. It involved my mother. Patricia slowly stepped out onto the front porch, pulling her expensive robe tightly around her shoulders. She looked past the tow trucks, past the police cruisers, and out into the street. The loud commotion, the sirens, and the flashing lights had woken up every single person on our wealthy, exclusive block. Patricia froze in absolute horror. Standing on their pristine lawns, standing on their massive front porches were dozens of our elite, wealthy neighbors. They were not just watching the humiliation. Almost every single one of them was holding up a glowing smartphone, actively recording the entire pathetic scene. Mrs. Higgins, the strict president of the Homeowners Association, was standing at the edge of her property line, shaking her head in complete and utter disgust as she filmed Terrence being shoved into the police car. For 10 years, Patricia had meticulously crafted an impenetrable illusion of absolute superiority. She had ruthlessly judged everyone else to mask her own massive financial failures. And now, in the middle of the night, under the glare of flashing police lights, that entire fake empire completely shattered into a million unfixable pieces. The entire neighborhood now knew they were completely broke, deeply in debt, and violently unhinged. Patricia let out a quiet, defeated sob, covered her face with her trembling hands, and ran back inside the dark house. The tow trucks lifted the luxury vehicles into the air and drove away, leaving behind an empty driveway and a completely destroyed reputation. The morning after the repossession was suffocatingly quiet. The heavy, oppressive summer heat had fully invaded the upper levels of the house, turning the dark, powerless rooms into an absolute sauna. Terrence was currently sitting in a holding cell at the county jail, and a judge had set his bail at a staggering $25,000 due to his violent outburst against the recovery agents and the police. Because the dummy corporate trust account was completely useless for cash withdrawals and their personal bank accounts were entirely overdrawn, Vanessa had absolutely no way to get her husband out. She spent the entire morning frantically pacing the sweltering living room, desperately calling every single person in her wealthy social circle to beg for a temporary loan. But the neighborhood gossip mill moved with incredible speed. Everyone had already seen the humiliating videos of Terrence being shoved into a police cruiser in his underwear. Not a single person answered her frantic phone calls. Vanessa was completely backed into a corner. Her entire identity was built on projecting an image of flawless wealth and superiority. The thought of her husband sitting behind iron bars with common criminals was tearing her fragile ego to shreds. She needed cash immediately, and she was willing to do absolutely anything to get it. I had decided to leave the house early that morning to grab breakfast at a local cafe, simply to avoid the toxic energy radiating from the upper floors. I was sitting at a quiet corner table enjoying a fresh pastry when a sharp notification chimed on my encrypted phone. It was a motion detection alert from the hidden security camera I had legally installed inside my basement apartment. I opened the live feed application expecting to see my father trying to snoop around for loose change. Instead, the high-definition night vision camera clearly captured Vanessa creeping slowly down the wooden stairs. She looked incredibly paranoid, constantly checking over her shoulder. She tiptoed into my room and walked straight over to my desk. From her silk robe pocket, she pulled out a small, familiar black velvet jewelry box. I recognized it instantly. It was the box that held Patricia's most prized possession, a massive, flawless 3-carat diamond anniversary ring that she wore to every single country club event to aggressively flaunt her perceived wealth. On the crisp video feed, I watched Vanessa open the box, pull the heavy diamond ring out, and shove the jewelry deep into her own pocket. Then, she took the empty black velvet box, opened my bottom desk drawer, and carefully buried it underneath a stack of my blank printer paper. She quickly shut the drawer and practically sprinted back up the stairs. She had just stolen our mother's most prized possession to pawn for bail money, and she was deliberately planting the empty box in my room to ensure I took the absolute fall for the crime. It was a textbook scapegoat maneuver. For my entire life, whenever Vanessa made a catastrophic mistake or broke a rule, she simply pointed her finger at me, and my parents eagerly punished me to protect their perfect golden child. But those days were officially over. I finished my coffee, saved the high-definition video clip directly to my secure cloud drive, and casually drove back to the house. The moment I opened the heavy front door, I was met with a wall of blistering heat and the sound of completely unhinged screaming. "It is gone!" Patricia shrieked, her voice echoing violently through the dark hallway. "Someone broke into the master bedroom and stole my diamond ring. That ring is worth $40,000. We have been completely robbed." I walked calmly toward the kitchen. Patricia was tearing the room apart, ripping open drawers and violently throwing expensive silverware onto the floor in a blind panic. Richard was standing near the sink, sweating heavily, looking completely overwhelmed. Vanessa was standing right next to Patricia, rubbing her mother's shoulder and playing the role of the deeply concerned, supportive daughter. "Nobody broke into the house, Mom," Vanessa said smoothly, her voice dripping with calculated manipulation. "The electronic security gates were locked all night. The thief has to be someone who already lives inside this house." Vanessa slowly turned her head and locked her eyes entirely on me as I stepped into the kitchen. Her expression was cold and vicious. "Sydney left the house bright and early this morning," Vanessa stated loudly, ensuring every word landed like a heavy blow. "She was acting incredibly smug last night when the police were here. She is the only person in this family who actually needs money. She probably stole the ring out of pure spite to punish us." Patricia slowly stopped tearing the kitchen apart. She turned around to face me, her eyes completely bloodshot and wild with fury. Her chest heaved rapidly as she fully absorbed Vanessa's toxic lie. "You ungrateful, vindictive little monster!" Patricia growled aggressively, marching toward me. "You stole my anniversary ring. I am going to tear your room apart, and when I find it, I am having you arrested for grand larceny." Patricia did not even wait for me to respond. She stormed past me, her heavy footsteps thundering down the wooden stairs toward the basement. Vanessa shot me a triumphant, wicked smirk and immediately followed her mother down into the cool, air-conditioned room. Richard trailed behind them, loudly muttering threats about sending me to prison. I followed them down at a leisurely pace. By the time I reached the bottom of the stairs, Vanessa was already putting on an incredible theatrical performance. She rushed straight over to my desk and aggressively yanked open the bottom drawer. "Look!" Vanessa gasped dramatically, plunging her hand under the stack of printer paper. She pulled out the empty black velvet jewelry box and held it up like a massive trophy. She hid the box in her desk. She took the ring. Patricia let out a guttural sound of pure rage. She lunged toward me, raising her manicured hand as if she was going to slap me directly across the face. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply held up my phone, the screen already glowing brightly in the dim room. "I would not take another step if I were you," I said, my voice completely deadpan and authoritative. Patricia froze, her hand still raised in the air. "When you legally forced me to sign a residential lease agreement, you surrendered your right to privacy inside this specific dwelling," I explained calmly, tapping the screen of my phone. "I am legally permitted to monitor my own secure living space." I tapped the play button and turned the screen around so Patricia, Richard, and Vanessa could all see it perfectly. The high-definition, crystal-clear video began to play. They watched in absolute stunned silence as the digital version of Vanessa crept down the stairs. They watched her pull the velvet box from her pocket. They watched her remove the massive diamond ring, securely pocket it, and carefully hide the empty box exactly where she had just pretended to magically discover it. The video ended, and a suffocating, heavy silence fell over the room. The only sound was the quiet hum of my air conditioning unit. Patricia slowly lowered her hand. She turned her head and looked at Vanessa. The illusion of the perfect, flawless golden child did not just crack. It completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Vanessa stood completely frozen by the desk, the empty velvet box slipping from her trembling fingers and dropping onto the carpet. "Mom, I can explain," Vanessa stammered, her voice suddenly high and terrified. "Terrence needed bail money. I was going to buy it back from the pawn shop as soon as his commissions cleared. I swear I was going to put it back. You stole from me. Patricia whispered, her voice shaking with a level of profound betrayal and heartbreak I had never heard before. You let me blame your sister. You were going to let her go to prison just to cover your own tracks. It was her fault, Vanessa shrieked, desperately pointing a shaking finger at me. If she had just given us the emergency trust money, I would not have had to take the ring. She forced me to do this. But the pathetic manipulation completely failed. For the first time in my entire life, Patricia did not take Vanessa's side. Patricia stepped forward and forcefully slapped the empty velvet box out of Vanessa's hand. Get out of my sight! Patricia screamed, her face twisting in pure agony. The mother and daughter alliance, the toxic foundation that had violently controlled this family for decades, was completely and permanently destroyed. The mother and daughter alliance, the toxic foundation that had violently controlled this family for decades, was completely and permanently destroyed. The suffocating heat of the powerless house felt even heavier as the afternoon dragged on, turning the massive estate into an absolute pressure cooker of resentment and paranoia. Vanessa retreated to an empty upstairs bedroom, locking the door behind her to escape Patricia's furious, heartbroken sobbing. About an hour later, the front door slowly creaked open. Terrence walked inside, looking absolutely horrific. Vanessa had apparently managed to secure his release through a shady local bail bondsman by physically handing over her entire collection of authentic designer handbags as collateral. Terrence was still wearing his wrinkled, dirt-stained silk boxers and a massive oversized t-shirt the jail had given him. He smelled like sweat and cheap disinfectant. He did not say a word to anyone. He just shuffled into the living room and collapsed onto the expensive leather sofa, staring blankly at the dark ceiling. The silence in the house was abruptly shattered by 3 loud, sharp knocks at the front door. Richard, who was pacing the grand foyer and violently rubbing his temples aggressively, ripped the door open. A uniformed courier was standing on the porch holding a thick, rigid cardboard envelope and an electronic signature pad. The courier demanded Richard's legal signature for a certified priority delivery. Richard snatched the stylus, scribbled his name, and tore the heavy envelope open the second the courier turned around. I stood at the top of the basement stairs, perfectly concealed in the shadows, watching the exact moment my ultimate financial fail-safe was delivered. I had instructed my shadow bank to send this specific legal document the absolute second Terrence was formally processed into the county jail system. Richard pulled out a thick stack of heavy watermarked legal paper. The letterhead belonged to one of the most ruthless and aggressive corporate litigation firms in the entire country. As Richard began to read the bold, densely typed paragraphs, all the remaining color instantly drained from his face. His hands started shaking so violently that the thick papers rattled loudly against each other. His breathing became incredibly shallow and rapid, echoing in the quiet, hot hallway. "What is it, Richard?" Patricia asked, her voice raspy and weak from crying over her stolen diamond ring. "Is it the neighborhood association again? Are they finalizing the lien on the house?" Richard did not answer her. He slowly looked up from the papers and locked his eyes directly onto Terrence, who was still slumped lifelessly on the couch. A low, dangerous growl built up in Richard's throat, transforming into a roar of pure, unfiltered rage. "You absolute idiot!" Richard screamed, his voice cracking with unprecedented fury. "You arrogant, stupid, greedy parasite. Greedy!" Terrence flinched, sitting up slightly, his bruised ego instantly flaring back to life. "Do not yell at me, old man." Terrence snapped back, his voice hoarse. "I just spent the entire night sleeping on a freezing concrete floor because of your stupid unpaid bills." Richard aggressively marched into the living room and threw the heavy stack of legal papers directly at Terrence's face. The sharp pages scattered all over the expensive rug. "Read it!" Richard shrieked, pointing a violently shaking finger at the documents. "Read what your pathetic little stunt at the bank yesterday just did to this entire family." Patricia rushed over and picked up the first page of the document, her eyes frantically scanning the dense legal text. Her jaw dropped open in absolute horror. "The primary family trust has been permanently dissolved," she read aloud, her voice trembling with sheer panic. Notice of immediate termination. Due to the presentation of an unauthorized hostile power of attorney document by a non-beneficiary, the financial institution has flagged the entire estate for severe corporate fraud. Terrence stared at Patricia, his face going completely blank. "What does that mean?" he asked, his arrogant facade finally crumbling into genuine fear. "It means you completely killed the golden goose," Richard roared, kicking the heavy glass coffee table so hard it cracked right down the middle. "Because you were so incredibly desperate to get your hands on a luxury car and steal Sydney's emergency money, you triggered a massive fraud alert. The bank thinks you tried to orchestrate a hostile takeover of the trust accounts. They have permanently closed every single credit line. The money is completely gone, Terrence. We are entirely cut off." Patricia let out a loud, terrifying shriek and dropped the paper. "But it gets much worse." Richard continued, his chest heaving rapidly. He picked up the second page and shoved it into Terrence's chest. "Because of your suspected fraud, the federal banking regulators are stepping in. The litigation firm is launching a mandatory comprehensive 10-year forensic audit of the entire trust. They are going to investigate every single penny this family has spent for the last decade. If they find any financial discrepancies or unauthorized withdrawals, they are going to press federal embezzlement charges against all of us." The reality of the situation hit the room like a physical explosion. The fake empire was not just crumbling, it was being actively investigated by federal authorities. They were all staring directly down the barrel of massive prison sentences. "This is entirely your fault," Richard screamed, stepping closer to Terrence and raising his fists. "You had to have that stupid Porsche. You had to show off to your pathetic little friends. You destroyed this family. You ruined my life. I should have never let Vanessa marry a broke, flashy loser like you." Terrence shot up from the couch, his towering frame completely dwarfing Richard. The humiliation of the arrest, the repossession, and the blistering insults finally pushed Terrence over the absolute edge. He aggressively shoved Richard backward, his eyes burning with intense malice. "Do not you dare stand there and pretend you are an innocent victim," Terrence roared, his deep voice echoing violently off the walls. "You want to talk about financial discrepancies, old man? You want to talk about federal embezzlement charges? Let us talk about where the trust money really went." Richard froze. His aggressive posture instantly collapsed, replaced by a look of sheer naked terror. "Shut your mouth, Terrence," Richard whispered frantically, glancing nervously at Patricia. "No, I am not going down for this by myself," Terrence shouted, turning to face his mother-in-law. "You think your perfect husband is a financial victim, Patricia? Have you ever bothered to look at the offshore wire transfers? Richard has been actively skimming thousands of dollars from the family trust every single month for the last 5 years. He owes massive debts to an underground sports betting syndicate. He has a severe gambling addiction." Patricia stumbled backward, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. She looked at Richard, her eyes pleading for him to deny the horrific accusation. "Richard, tell me he is lying," she begged, her voice breaking completely. "Tell me you did not steal from our family to gamble." Richard could not look her in the eye. He stared down at the cracked glass coffee table, his silence serving as an absolute, undeniable confession. Terrence laughed bitterly, a harsh, ugly sound that filled the suffocating room. "That is right," Terrence sneered, pointing at Richard. "While you were busy judging me for leasing a luxury car, your precious husband was wiring $50,000 at a time to offshore bookies just to keep his kneecaps from being shattered by loan sharks. When those federal auditors dig into the last 10 years of bank statements, they are not going to care about my car loan. They are going to see the massive trail of illegal gambling wire transfers. You are going to federal prison, Richard." Patricia let out a sound that was barely human. It was a visceral scream of absolute soul-crushing betrayal. In a single 24-hour period, she had lost her expensive home, her utilities, her flawless social reputation, her daughter's loyalty, her diamond ring, and now the absolute total destruction of her marriage. She lunged forward and began violently pounding her fists against Richard's chest, screaming hysterically about his lies and his deceit. Richard did not even try to defend himself. He just stood there, taking the physical blows, completely broken and defeated. I quietly backed away from the top of the stairs, a cold, satisfied smile spreading across my face. I retreated into my air-conditioned sanctuary and locked the door. My ultimate trap had worked flawlessly. By simply turning off the endless flow of my own money, I had forced them to turn on each other like starving animals. The family was actively tearing itself to pieces, and the grand finale was still waiting just around the corner. The grand finale I had prepared was scheduled to align perfectly with an event Patricia had been planning for months. In any rational family, the sudden revelation of massive federal embezzlement, the complete loss of all electrical utilities, and the impending threat of federal prison would be more than enough reason to cancel a social gathering. But Patricia was completely detached from reality. She was entirely consumed by the desperate clawing need to maintain her flawless public image. That coming Saturday was her and Richard's 30th wedding anniversary. She had mailed out heavy gold embossed invitations to 50 of the wealthiest, most influential couples in our elite neighborhood weeks ago. Despite the fact that her husband had stolen their money to pay off underground bookies, and her house was sitting in pitch-black darkness, Patricia flatly refused to cancel the lavish celebration. She firmly believed that if she canceled the party, it would serve as an absolute confirmation of the humiliating rumors currently swirling around the neighborhood after Terrence was arrested on the front lawn. She needed to prove to Mrs. Higgins and the rest of the country club elite that the repossession was just a ridiculous misunderstanding and that the family was still incredibly wealthy and powerful. But to throw a party of that magnitude, she desperately needed cash. The elite catering company she had hired demanded their final payment up front before they would even unload their trucks. Because the Tier 2 corporate shell account was locked and her personal credit cards were permanently frozen, Patricia was forced to do the unthinkable. Through my network monitoring, I watched her digitally apply for a predatory high-interest payday loan. A woman who used to openly mock working-class people was now taking out a desperate cash advance at a staggering 40% interest rate just to pay for imported caviar and a jazz quartet. She also used a portion of that toxic loan to rent a massive whisper-quiet industrial generator, hiding it behind the back hedges to temporarily power the grand ballroom and the main kitchen just for the evening. However, the payday loan simply was not enough to cover the entire cost of the event. She had enough cash to pay for the gourmet food and the expensive alcohol, but she could not afford to hire the professional waitstaff to serve it. On Friday afternoon, the heavy basement door swung open. Patricia marched down the wooden stairs carrying a plastic garment bag. She looked absolutely exhausted, her eyes sunken and her skin pale, but her face was set in a mask of vicious determination. She unzipped the bag and aggressively threw a piece of clothing directly onto my desk. It was a stiff, uncomfortable black polyester dress and a cheap white serving apron. "The catering company is dropping off the food tomorrow afternoon," Patricia stated coldly, her voice completely devoid of any maternal warmth. "But they are not providing servers. You are going to put on this uniform tomorrow night. You will carry the silver trays, you will pour the champagne, and you will clean up the empty plates. You will not speak to any of my guests unless they speak to you first." I looked down at the cheap uniform, genuinely amazed by her absolute audacity. "You want me to work as your unpaid servant?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly flat. "Why would I ever do that? You just accused me of stealing your diamond ring yesterday." Patricia slammed her hands down on my desk, leaning in close to my face. "Because if you do not do exactly what I tell you, I will completely destroy your pathetic little life," she hissed maliciously. "I am your mother, Sydney. I know your social security number. I have all of your personal identification documents in my upstairs safe. If you embarrass me tomorrow night by refusing to serve my guests, I will go online and take out a dozen predatory loans in your name. I will max out credit cards under your identity and completely destroy your credit score. You will never be able to rent an apartment or buy a car for the rest of your life." It was a blatant, unhinged felony threat. It was also incredibly hilarious to me, considering I was a multimillionaire and she was currently drowning in toxic debt. I could have laughed right in her face. I could have told her that my identity was protected by an ironclad corporate security firm, and she would be arrested the second she tried to use my social security number. But I did not. I needed to be in that ballroom tomorrow night. I needed a front row seat to watch the absolute destruction of her fake empire. I let my shoulders slump perfectly, playing the role of the terrified, obedient daughter. Okay, I whispered softly, looking down at my hands. I will wear the uniform. I will serve the champagne. Please do not ruin my credit. Patricia smiled a cold, triumphant smirk that did not reach her eyes. Good girl, she sneered. Make sure your hair is pulled back tight. I do not want you looking messy in front of my friends. Saturday evening arrived, and the absolute sheer delusion of the event was staggering. The rented generator hummed quietly in the backyard, pumping electricity into the massive crystal chandeliers of the main ballroom. The jazz quartet played smooth, elegant music in the corner. Exactly at 7 o'clock, the luxury cars began pulling into our circular driveway. I stood in the corner of the room, wearing the stiff black dress and the bright white apron, holding a heavy silver tray loaded with crystal flutes of expensive champagne. I watched as Patricia greeted her guests at the front door. She was wearing a rented designer gown, her face painted with heavy makeup to hide the dark circles under her eyes. She pasted on a terrifyingly wide fake smile, loudly kissing the cheeks of the wealthy women she secretly despised. Richard was forced to play the role of the loving husband. He was sweating profusely in his tailored tuxedo, his hands shaking slightly as he stood by Patricia's side. Every time a guest looked away, Richard immediately grabbed a glass of strong scotch from the passing trays and downed it in a single gulp, desperately trying to numb his absolute terror over the impending federal audit. Terrence and Vanessa were also forced to attend to complete the illusion of the perfect family. They stood in opposite corners of the massive room, violently glaring at each other. Terrence was wearing an old suit because his new ones had been confiscated by the bail bondsman. Vanessa looked completely hollow, her eyes darting nervously around the room as if she expected the police to burst through the doors at any second. The tension in the air was incredibly thick. The wealthy guests were perfectly polite to Patricia's face, complimenting her dress and her beautiful home, but the second they turned around, the vicious whispering began. I could hear them quietly gossiping about Terrence's arrest, the missing luxury cars, and the sudden unexplained darkness of the house over the last 2 weeks. I moved silently through the crowd, playing my part to absolute perfection. I kept my head down and my eyes lowered. Whenever Patricia caught my eye, she would sharply snap her fingers at me loudly, ordering me to fetch more napkins or refill a glass, deliberately treating me like absolute garbage in front of her high society friends to assert her dominance. More champagne over here, Sydney, and be quick about it, Patricia commanded loudly as I passed her group. Do not just stand there staring. Right away, ma'am, I replied meekly, carefully filling her glass. I handed a drink to Terrence, who scoffed and rolled his eyes at my uniform. I offered a napkin to Vanessa, who snatched it from my tray without even looking at me. They all treated me like I was completely invisible, like I was nothing more than a piece of furniture in their grand, pathetic play. But as I stood quietly against the back wall, listening to the jazz music and watching them desperately cling to their fake wealth, a genuine smile finally touched my lips. I was exactly where I needed to be, perfectly positioned in the shadows, waiting for the heavy knock at the front door that was going to bring their entire world crashing down forever. At exactly 8 o'clock, the jazz quartet gently transitioned into a soft, romantic melody. Richard stepped into the absolute center of the grand ballroom, wiping a thick layer of sweat from his forehead with a white silk handkerchief. He picked up a crystal champagne flute from a passing server and loudly tapped the side with a silver spoon. The sharp, high-pitched clinking sound echoed through the sweltering room, commanding the immediate attention of the 50 wealthy guests. The low hum of vicious gossip slowly faded into a tense, uncomfortable silence. Patricia moved to stand directly beside him, forcing her stiff, terrified face into an expression of absolute adoring devotion. She linked her arm through his, projecting the perfect image of a flawless high society marriage. Richard cleared his throat, desperately trying to steady his trembling hands. Friends, family, and esteemed guests. Richard began, his voice booming artificially across the room. 30 years ago today, Patricia and I made a sacred vow. We promised to build a life together, founded on absolute trust, unwavering integrity, and traditional family values. Looking around this magnificent room tonight, I am incredibly proud to say We have achieved exactly that. We have raised a beautiful family. We have weathered every single storm through honesty and dedication. We are the living proof that when you do things the right way, when you protect your assets with honor, the universe rewards you with endless abundance. The sheer, staggering hypocrisy of his words was almost suffocating. He was actively standing in a dark house powered by a rented gas generator owing millions of dollars to a toxic shell corporation, facing federal embezzlement charges for stealing family funds to pay off underground gambling syndicates. Yet he stood there, chin held high, lecturing the wealthiest people in the county about integrity and financial honor. Patricia smiled radiantly, basking in the polite golf clap applause from the crowd. She leaned her head against his shoulder. To another 30 years of perfect prosperity, she announced loudly, raising her own glass. Before a single guest could bring their drink to their lips, to toast the massive lie, a sound completely shattered the elegant atmosphere. It was a heavy, violent, booming knock at the massive oak front doors. This was not the polite, gentle tapping of a late-arriving party guest. This was the aggressive, rhythmic pounding of absolute authority. The heavy wooden doors actually rattled in their heavy iron frames. The jazz quartet immediately stopped playing. The sudden silence in the massive ballroom was deafening save for the distant hum of the backyard generator. Patricia let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh, her eyes darting frantically around the room. "Goodness," she stammered, her fake smile completely freezing on her face. "Who on earth could be arriving this late? Terrence, please go be a gentleman and get the door for our stragglers." Terrence practically dragged his feet across the marble foyer, his jaw clenched tight. He reached out and violently yanked the heavy door open, fully prepared to yell at whoever was ruining the perfectly orchestrated illusion. But the aggressive words completely died in his throat. Standing on the front porch was the imposing figure of the county sheriff, fully dressed in his dark tactical uniform, his heavy utility belt completely loaded. Flanking him on either side were two men wearing sharp professional gray suits, both holding thick leather briefcases and heavy clipboards. The flashing red and blue lights of three police cruisers parked directly on the front lawn cast an eerie, rhythmic glow through the open doorway. Richard, Patricia, and Vanessa the sheriff announced loudly, his deep authoritative voice carrying effortlessly into the grand ballroom. Every single guest turned their head, their eyes wide with absolute shock and morbid curiosity. Richard dropped his silk handkerchief. He rushed forward, waving his hands frantically in a desperate attempt to keep the officers out of the main room. "Officer, please," Richard pleaded, his voice dropping to a panicked whisper. "We are hosting a very private elite anniversary celebration. Whatever minor issue this is, we can step into my office and quietly resolve it. Please do not make a scene in front of my guests." The sheriff did not lower his voice. He did not step into the private office. He marched straight past Terrence and walked directly into the center of the grand ballroom, the two bank representatives following closely behind him. The wealthy guests quickly parted, like the Red Sea, frantically stepping back to avoid any association with the arriving law enforcement. "There is no minor issue to resolve privately, sir," the sheriff stated clearly, ensuring every single person in the room heard his exact words. "I am here executing a lawful court-ordered mandate on behalf of the federal banking regulators and Apex Wealth Management." One of the men in this gray suit stepped forward, pulling a thick stack of aggressively stamped legal documents from his clipboard. "Richard, as of 9 o'clock this morning, this property has been completely and legally foreclosed upon," the bank representative announced, his tone cold and entirely devoid of emotion. "Due to severe unresolved financial default, massive corporate fraud investigations, and the permanent dissolution of your primary funding trust, the bank seized the deed to this estate. The property was successfully sold at a private commercial auction this afternoon. You no longer own this house. Longer." A collective dramatic gasp echoed through the ballroom. Mrs. Higgins, the incredibly strict neighborhood association president, covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes absolutely gleaming with the ultimate validation of all her vicious rumors. "That is completely impossible," Vanessa shrieked, breaking away from her corner and running toward the officers. "You cannot just sell our family home in one day. My husband has an $800,000 corporate credit line. We are incredibly wealthy." The second bank representative looked at Vanessa with complete pity. "Ma'am, the corporate shell account your husband attached his name to is currently holding millions of dollars in toxic commercial debt. Your husband is actively under investigation for attempting to fraudulently access restricted funds. Your personal bank accounts are completely overdrawn. This estate was the final remaining asset, and it now belongs entirely to the new buyer." The sheriff stepped forward again, holding out a bright yellow legal notice. He forcefully slapped the paper directly onto the chest of Richard's expensive tuxedo. "By order of the county court, you are hereby served with an emergency non-negotiable notice to vacate the premises," the sheriff commanded. "Because the new property owner has explicitly refused to grant any extensions, you have exactly 24 hours to pack your personal belongings and leave this property. If you, your wife, or your extended family are still inside this house by 8 o'clock tomorrow evening, my deputies will physically remove you for criminal trespassing." The brutal reality of those words hung heavily in the sweltering air. 24 hours. The fake empire was not just crumbling over time, it had been completely demolished in a single sentence. The illusion of wealth, the arrogant superiority, the flawless reputation, it was all entirely gone. Patricia stood absolutely frozen next to the deserted jazz band setup. Her brain simply could not process the massive scale of the humiliation. All of her wealthiest friends, the people she had spent decades trying to impress and intimidate, were actively watching her get thrown out into the street by the police. The perfectly crafted mask she wore finally cracked and fell away completely. She did not scream. She did not cry or throw a dramatic tantrum like she usually did. Patricia's eyes rolled completely back into her head. Her knees buckled beneath her. She collapsed forward, hitting the hard marble floor with a heavy, sickening thud. The crystal champagne flute she was holding shattered into 100 pieces, the expensive alcohol soaking directly into her rented designer gown. It was not a fake theatrical performance to gain sympathy. It was a genuine, complete physical shutdown brought on by absolute psychological shock. Richard fell to his knees beside her, frantically shaking her shoulders, but she was completely unresponsive. The 50 wealthy guests did not rush forward to help. Instead, they immediately started backing toward the exit, whispering frantically to each other, eager to escape the humiliating disaster and spread the incredible gossip to the rest of the neighborhood. I stood quietly in my corner, my hands resting neatly on my silver serving tray. I watched the sheriff turn around and walk out the front door. I watched the guests flee into the night. I watched my completely broken family kneeling in the center of the dark rented ballroom. The ultimate payoff was unfolding exactly as I had designed it. Richard was still kneeling on the marble floor next to Patricia, frantically patting her cheeks to wake her up. The two bank representatives and the sheriff stood completely motionless, offering absolutely no sympathy. The remaining guests, who were inching toward the heavy wooden exit doors, suddenly froze in their tracks. Human curiosity is an incredibly powerful force, especially among the wealthy elite. The sheer promise of witnessing a massive, scandalous downfall was far too intoxicating for them to simply walk away. Mrs. Higgins actually took a step back into the ballroom, her eyes wide, desperate to absorb every single detail of the destruction. Suddenly, Richard stopped shaking his unconscious wife. A new wave of desperate, frantic energy washed over him. He scrambled to his feet, his tuxedo knees covered in dust, and aggressively marched right up to the primary bank representative. "This has to be a mistake," Richard pleaded, his voice thick with panic and heavy denial. "You said the property was sold at a private commercial auction today. Who bought it? I demand to know who purchased my family home. Give me the name of the buyer. I will negotiate with them directly. I can offer them a massive return on their investment once I liquidate my other assets. Just tell me who owns Apex Holdings. I demand to speak to the chief executive officer right now." The bank representative adjusted his glasses and looked down at his clipboard, his expression completely blank and strictly professional. "Sir, the owner of the purchasing entity is actually already present in this room," the representative stated calmly. Richard whipped his head around his wild eyes, frantically scanning the crowd of 50 wealthy guests. He looked at the local politicians, the doctors, the corporate lawyers, desperately trying to figure out which of his supposed friends had secretly bought his foreclosed estate out from under him. "Who is it?" Richard demanded loudly, his voice echoing in the grand space. "Which one of you bought my house?" I took a deep, steadying breath. I reached behind my waist and slowly untied the harsh, scratchy strings of the cheap white serving apron my mother had forced me to wear. I let the apron drop heavily onto the marble floor. I set my silver serving tray down on a nearby cocktail table. I stepped out of the dark, unnoticed corner of the ballroom and walked directly into the center of the room, standing right under the glow of the massive crystal chandelier. "You are looking at her," I said, my voice clear, calm, and projecting perfectly across the silent ballroom. Richard slowly turned his head to look at me. His brain was completely misfiring. He looked at my black polyester uniform, then back to the bank representative, and then back to me. "What are you talking about, Sydney?" Richard snapped impatiently, completely dismissing me out of pure habit. "Get back to the catering station. This is a highly sensitive legal matter and it absolutely does not concern you." I did not move a single inch. "I am the sole owner and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings," I repeated, looking him dead in the eye without blinking. "I am also the primary beneficiary and sole financial provider of the blind trust you have been aggressively draining for the last 10 years. And as of 9 o'clock this morning, I am the legal absolute owner of the estate you are currently standing in." Vanessa let out a harsh, nervous laugh from the other side of the room. "She is completely insane," Vanessa announced to the crowd, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She is a broke data entry clerk who lives in our basement. She is just trying to embarrass us because she is jealous. Do not listen to a single word she says." Terrence stood frozen, his eyes darting between me and the bank representatives. Unlike Vanessa, Terrence had seen the massive credit lines. He had seen the dummy corporate shell accounts and signed the power of attorney. The terrifying realization was slowly starting to dawn on him. I did not waste my breath arguing with Vanessa. I did not need to scream or defend myself against her pathetic insults. I had absolute, undeniable proof. I turned my back to my family and walked over to the expensive audiovisual control panel that Patricia had set up to play a romantic anniversary slideshow later in the evening. I pulled my encrypted smartphone from my pocket and plugged the direct connection cable into the main projection system. I tapped the control screen and the massive motorized white canvas projector screen slowly lowered from the ceiling right behind the jazz band. The projector hummed to life, casting a bright, blinding, rectangular light across the dark room. "I am not going to stand here and debate my financial status with you," I said loudly, ensuring the microphone picked up my voice and broadcast it through the massive surround sound speakers. "I am just going to show everyone exactly who this family really is, and exactly why I am throwing you out into the street tonight." I pressed play on my phone. The crystal-clear high-definition video that Aunt Brenda had accidentally texted me 2 weeks ago suddenly exploded onto the massive screen. The sound of the sparkling Miami ocean waves and the heavy yacht engine blasted through the ballroom speakers. The 50 wealthy guests gasped collectively as they saw the massive, luxurious boat. There was Terrence wearing his ridiculous $5,000 imported silk shirt, holding a crystal champagne flute. His loud, arrogant laughter echoed through the silent, tense ballroom. Sydney is a pathetic failure, the digital version of Terrence laughed cruelly on the screen. She is 27 years old and hiding in the basement doing data entry like a total loser. She should be grateful we even let her breathe our air. I watched the real Terrence physically shrink in the corner of the ballroom. Several of the wealthy guests turned to look at him with expressions of absolute, unfiltered disgust. Then the digital version of my mother leaned into the frame, adjusting her diamond-studded sunglasses. Patricia was currently unconscious on the floor, but her cruel, vicious voice boomed through the speakers for the entire neighborhood elite to hear. "She is a massive leech on the family trust," Patricia sneered on the massive screen. "If it were up to me, I would have thrown her out into the street years ago. She brings absolutely nothing to this family but embarrassment." The video ended and the screen faded to pitch black. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and incredibly profound. The guests stared at the blank screen, completely horrified by the staggering cruelty they had just witnessed. They had all attended this lavish anniversary party under the assumption that Richard and Patricia were a loving, traditional family. The video completely exposed them as vicious, arrogant bullies who aggressively mocked their own blood relative behind her back, while actively spending the family money on luxury yacht rentals. I disconnected my phone and turned to face Richard. He was staring at the blank projector screen, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish gasping for air. The absolute humiliation was paralyzing him. He could not form a single coherent sentence. "You called me a pathetic failure," I stated coldly, my voice slicing through the heavy silence. "You called me a leech. You banished me to a dark basement and charged me rent to live in my own house. But the absolute truth, Richard, is that I am the only reason you have not been homeless for the last decade." I walked over to the catering table and picked up a thick, heavy black leather binder I had prepared specifically for this exact moment. I slammed the binder down onto the glass table right next to Richard. The loud smack made him flinch violently. The video was just the introduction. It was finally time for the full financial autopsy. I opened the heavy black leather binder, revealing a massive stack of perfectly organized, legally certified financial documents. I did not just hand one to Richard. I had meticulously prepared 4 identical copies. I walked around the shattered glass of the coffee table, handing a binder to Terrence, tossing one at Vanessa's feet, and gently laying the last one on the floor right next to Patricia's unconscious body. "Open them," I commanded, my voice echoing coldly in the massive room. Richard's hands shook violently as he opened the cover. Terrence knelt down and picked his face completely pale. The first page of the binder was a simple single sheet of paper. It was the original deposit receipt from 10 years ago, completely unredacted, showing a direct wire transfer of $14 million into the newly formed blind trust. And right at the top, listed as the sole proprietor, the only source of the capital was my full legal name. There was no distant great uncle, I stated, pacing slowly back and forth across the marble floor. There was no magical family inheritance. When I was 17 years old, I sold a proprietary data compression algorithm to a massive tech conglomerate. That $14 million was entirely mine. I earned every single penny of it. Vanessa picked up her binder from the floor, her eyes frantically scanning the numbers. "That is impossible," she whispered, her voice completely hollow. "You are a data entry clerk. You make minimum wage." I ignored her completely and turned my focus entirely onto Richard. "I created the blind trust because I knew exactly who you were, Richard." I continued, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "I knew you were drowning in massive debt. I knew you were secretly gambling away our food money to underground syndicates. I knew if I told you about my wealth, you would manipulate me, drain my accounts dry, and leave me with absolutely nothing. So I hired the best corporate lawyers in the state to build an ironclad fortress around my money, and I let you believe it was an inheritance." I instructed them to turn to the second tab in the binder. The pages rustled loudly in the quiet room. "Let us do a complete financial autopsy of the last 10 years, I announced, pointing directly at the detailed spreadsheets. "Let us look at exactly what my pathetic, useless existence has provided for this family." Page 2. The sprawling 5-bedroom colonial estate we are currently standing in. The mortgage was paid in full every single month by the trust. My money bought this house. My money kept the lights on. My money paid the massive property taxes so you could pretend to be neighborhood royalty. I turned to Vanessa. Page 4. Vanessa, your beautiful, flawless dream wedding at the country club 3 years ago. The one where you specifically banned me from being a bridesmaid because my cheap clothes would ruin your aesthetic photos. The one where you mocked me in front of your friends for arriving in a beat-up Honda Civic. I paid the $75,000 catering bill. I paid for your imported silk dress. I paid for the completely unnecessary ice sculptures. My money bought your perfect day. Vanessa looked down at the spreadsheet, her eyes welling up with tears of absolute crushing humiliation. She had built her entire social identity on that wedding, constantly bragging about her elite status, completely unaware that the pathetic sister she banished to the basement was the sole financier of the entire event. And Terence, I said, turning my gaze to the towering man who was currently trembling in his cheap suit. Turn to page 7. Terence slowly turned the heavy pages, his face contorting in genuine agony as he looked at the itemized list of his entire fake life. Your luxury imported SUV lease, I read aloud from my own copy. Your premium country club membership fees. Your massive credit card bills from expensive steakhouses and designer boutiques. Your gold Rolex watch. All of it was completely subsidized by the trust. You are a completely mediocre real estate broker who has not closed a major commercial deal in over 4 years. You are entirely broke, Terence. You have always been completely broke. You just enjoyed playing dress up with my money. The wealthy guests who were still lingering near the exit doors were completely captivated by the brutal financial execution. They were witnessing the total dismantling of a family's entire identity, backed up by legally certified bank receipts. Mrs. Higgins was actively whispering the details to her husband, completely thrilled by the scandalous reality. For 10 years, I lived in a damp, unfinished basement. I said, my voice finally rising in volume, echoing with a decade of suppressed anger. You charged me rent to live in the house that I actively paid for. You stole my car keys. You threatened to ruin my credit score so I would serve champagne to your friends. You called me a leech. You called me a parasite. But the absolute truth is that every single one of you is completely dependent on me. You are all entirely useless without my bank accounts. Richard looked up from the binder, tears streaming down his face. He looked absolutely pathetic, a broken hollow shell of the arrogant patriarch he had pretended to be just an hour ago. Sydney, please, Richard begged, his voice cracking violently. We did not know. If we had known it was your money, we would have treated you differently. We would have respected you. I stared at him, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, hard disgust. That is exactly the problem, Richard, I replied sharply. You only respect people who have money. You only value human beings based on what they can financially provide for you. If you thought I was broke, I deserved to be treated like garbage. I deserved to be pushed into the basement and humiliated. That is not love. That is an absolute transaction. And your transaction has officially been declined. I closed my binder with a loud, definitive snap. The sound echoed through the grand ballroom like a gunshot. The complete financial truth was fully exposed in the harsh light of the rented generator, and there was absolutely nowhere left for them to hide. The complete financial truth was fully exposed in the harsh light of the rented generator, and there was absolutely nowhere left for them to hide. Or so I thought. Terence, whose entire identity was built on an incredibly fragile foundation of unearned arrogance, simply could not accept the reality of his total defeat. He looked down at the black leather binder in his hands, then looked around at the wealthy guests who were actively whispering and pointing at him. His face twisted into an ugly, desperate sneer. He violently threw the heavy binder onto the floor. You think you are so incredibly smart? Sidney Terence barked, his voice echoing loudly as he took 2 aggressive steps toward me. You think you can just embarrass us and take this house? You are forgetting one massive detail. Terence reached deep into the inside pocket of his cheap suit jacket. He pulled out a folded piece of thick legal paper. It was the power of attorney document he had forced me to sign when Patricia was faking her heart attack on the living room couch. He held it up high in the air, waving it around like a massive victory flag. I still have this, Terence shouted, a wild, manic grin spreading across his sweating face. I am the authorized signer on your precious Tier 2 emergency fund. The bank manager already validated it. I have an $800,000 corporate credit line sitting right in my pocket. I am going to march into that bank first thing on Monday morning, drain every single penny of your secret reserve cash, and buy this entire estate back from whatever holding company you just used. And when I do, I am going to legally banish you from this property forever. He stood there with his chest puffed out, breathing heavily, completely convinced that he had just delivered the ultimate checkmate. Vanessa, desperate for any shred of hope, stepped forward and stood behind him, glaring at me with a renewed sense of vicious confidence. For a brief moment, the grand ballroom was completely silent. And then I did something I had not done in a very long time in front of my family. I threw my head back and I laughed. It was not a polite chuckle. It was a loud, genuine, deeply satisfied laugh that carried all the way to the high ceilings. Terence slowly lowered his arm. His manic smile faltered. "What is so funny?" he demanded, his voice losing a fraction of its aggressive volume. "You really did not read a single word of the fine print, did you?" I asked, wiping a tear of amusement from the corner of my eye. "You were so completely blinded by the sight of my signature and the massive numbers on the bank screen that you eagerly attached your own name to a financial death warrant." I took a slow step toward him, my voice dropping to a cold, razor-sharp tone. "Let me explain exactly what that document is, Terence. The Tier 2 Emergency Fund is not a magical vault filled with liquid cash. It is a dummy corporate shell account. My private equity firm uses that specific holding company as a digital garbage disposal. We use it to hold massive amounts of toxic defaulting commercial debt from failed real estate ventures to balance our corporate tax liabilities." Terence stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. His brain was desperately trying to process the complex financial terminology. "When you took that document into the bank lobby, you did not gain access to my money." I continued enunciating every single word so the wealthy guests could hear exactly how foolish he was. "You officially authorized the transfer of liability. By presenting that power of attorney and forcing the bank manager to legally link your personal social security number to that specific corporate account, you voluntarily accepted full responsibility for every single toxic asset inside it." "No," Terence whispered, taking a stumbling step backward. "The paper said you gave me access to the reserve funds. The bank manager said I had a massive credit limit." "You had a revolving liability limit, Terence," I corrected him sharply. "And you triggered the absolute worst clause in the entire contract when you used that toxic shell account to secure the financing for your $130,000 luxury Porsche. You guaranteed a massive new loan using a defaulting corporate entity as your backing." I pointed a finger directly at his chest. "You are not a millionaire, Terence. As of yesterday morning, you are personally and legally responsible for over $800,000 in toxic commercial debt. When the bank inevitably audits that shell account next week and realizes you do not possess the actual liquid assets to cover the portfolio, they are going to call the entire massive debt due immediately." Vanessa let out a sharp, terrified gasp. She physically recoiled from Terence, pressing her back against the nearest wall. She was finally realizing the magnitude of the disaster. "But the absolute best part of your unbelievable arrogance," I said, turning my gaze to Vanessa, "is the specific legal capacity in which you signed that document. Do you remember what you told me when you shoved the pen into my hand, Terence? You proudly declared that you were signing it as the head of the household." Vanessa shook her head frantically. "No," she shrieked, her voice echoing in the large room. "I did not sign anything. I have absolutely nothing to do with that car or that account. My name is not on that paper." "It does not matter if you held the pen, Vanessa," I replied calmly. "You and Terence are legally married. You share joint financial accounts. When he officially signed that document as the head of your household, he legally bound your entire marital estate to the toxic debt portfolio. That means his debt is now your debt." The reality of their impending doom crashed down on them like a concrete wall. Terence dropped the power of attorney document. The piece of paper fluttered harmlessly to the marble floor. "Apex Wealth Management will not just repossess your cars," I explained, delivering the final crushing blow. "The litigation team is going to aggressively sue both of you for the entire $800,000 balance. Because you have absolutely no assets left to seize, they are going to seek a federal court order to garnish both of your wages. Every single time you earn a commission on a house, Terence the bank will take it. Every single paycheck you ever earn, Vanessa will be slashed in half before it even hits your bank account. You are going to spend the rest of your natural lives working minimum wage jobs just to pay off the interest on a debt you acquired because you were too greedy to read a legal contract." Terence dropped to his knees right there in the middle of the ballroom. The towering, flashy, arrogant man who had spent the last 10 years constantly insulting my intelligence was now kneeling in the dust of his shattered ego. He buried his face in his hands, letting out a pathetic, broken sob. Vanessa slid down the wall, clutching her hair and crying hysterically, completely mourning the absolute death of her high society future. They were entirely trapped, and they had eagerly locked the cage themselves. They were entirely trapped, and they had eagerly locked the cage themselves. The sheer weight of that realization seemed to physically crush the air completely out of the grand ballroom. Vanessa looked around the room, her expensive mascara running down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks. She looked at the horrified faces of the wealthy guests, the cold indifference of the county sheriff. And finally, she looked directly at me. The arrogant, untouchable golden child was completely shattered. She crawled forward across the cold marble floor, her rented designer gown dragging through spilled champagne and broken glass. She dropped heavily onto her knees, right in front of me, clasping her hands together in a desperate, pathetic gesture of prayer. "Sydney, please!" Vanessa sobbed, her voice a high-pitched, hysterical wail that echoed off the high ceilings. "You cannot do this to me. I am your sister. We share the exact same blood. If you enforce this debt, I will lose my membership at the country club. My friends will completely abandon me. Terrence and I will have to declare immediate bankruptcy. Please, you have so much money. You own the entire holding company. Just wipe the debt away. Cancel the loan. I will do absolutely anything you want. I will clean your new house. I will be your personal servant. Just please do not let them garnish my wages for the rest of my life." I looked down at her, feeling an absolute chilling emptiness where my familial love used to be. "Where was this deep sisterly bond when you explicitly banned me from your wedding?" I asked quietly. "Where was this overwhelming family loyalty when you deliberately stole Mom's diamond ring and actively tried to frame me for grand larceny so I would go to federal prison? You do not love me, Vanessa. You just love my money. And now that you cannot have it, you are finally experiencing the exact same helpless terror you inflicted on me for my entire life." Seeing Vanessa completely fail to manipulate me, Richard decided to try a different tactical approach. The anger and the sheer panic vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a sickening, deeply manipulative mask of fatherly affection. He stepped forward, opening his arms wide as if he were going to pull me into a warm, loving embrace. He actually managed to force a proud, watery smile onto his face, completely ignoring the sheriff standing just a few feet away. "Oh, Sydney, my brilliant, incredible girl!" Richard cooed, his voice dripping with toxic sweetness. "Do not you see what really happened here? We always knew you had this incredible, unmatched potential inside of you. We only pushed you because we knew you were smart, sweetie. We wanted you to succeed. We had to be tough on you, so you would learn how to be a ruthless, highly successful businesswoman in the real world. And look at you now. You are an absolute triumph. We are so incredibly proud of you. Now let us just put this silly little misunderstanding behind us, cancel these ridiculous legal actions, and go back to being a family." The sheer audacity of his gaslighting was physically repulsive. It was the exact same emotional manipulation he had used to control my mother and my sister for decades. I took a massive step backward, dodging his outstretched arms as if he were covered in a deadly infectious disease. "Do not ever touch me!" I snapped, my voice ringing out with absolute, undeniable authority. "You did not push me to succeed. You violently pushed me down the stairs of my own life so you could step on my back to reach the very top. You stole from my trust fund to pay off illegal sports betting syndicates. You maliciously charged me rent to sleep in a damp, unfinished basement while you spent my hard-earned money on imported caviar. There is absolutely no family left to go back to." I turned back to the black leather binder resting on the glass table. I flipped to the very last section and pulled out 3 brightly colored legal forms. They were the official court-stamped 24-hour eviction notices the sheriff had verified. I walked forward and firmly slapped the first notice directly against Richard's chest. I dropped the second one onto the floor right in front of Vanessa's knees. I tossed the third one onto the couch where Terrence was still quietly sobbing into his hands. "You have exactly 24 hours to pack whatever cheap, legally owned personal belongings you have left," I announced, ensuring every single person in the room heard my final judgment. "At exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow evening, the sheriff's deputies will return to this property. The locks will be changed. The electronic security gates will be permanently reprogrammed. If you are still standing on this property when that clock strikes 8, you will be violently arrested for criminal trespassing. The harsh finality of the eviction notices was the absolute breaking point for the wealthy guests. The sensational drama had reached its absolute peak, and none of them wanted to be present when the police inevitably started making arrests or asking questions about the fraud investigation. Without saying a single word, the elite members of the neighborhood began filing toward the massive oak front doors. They moved in total suffocating silence. Nobody stopped to offer Richard a comforting handshake. Nobody knelt down to console Vanessa. Mrs. Higgins led the silent procession, pausing right at the doorway to cast one final sweeping look of absolute disgust at my family before walking out into the hot summer night. The heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind them, sealing my family's total social exile. We were completely alone in the massive, dimly lit ballroom. The jazz quartet had quietly packed their instruments and slipped out the back door minutes ago. For a brief second, the only sound was the low, steady hum of the rented generator outside. And then the absolute chaos erupted. Having lost their wealthy audience, having lost their endless supply of money, and having lost their entire future, the family instantly turned their vicious rage onto each other. Terrence leaped up from the couch and violently shoved Richard, screaming at the top of his lungs that Richard's illegal gambling was the only reason the trust was being investigated by federal auditors. Richard screamed aggressively back, blaming Terrence for blindly signing the toxic loan document and bringing the corporate lawyers directly to their doorstep. Vanessa crawled over to Patricia, who was just starting to regain consciousness on the marble floor, and began hysterically shaking her, blaming her mother for raising her to be entirely dependent on a fake lifestyle. They were tearing each other to absolute shreds, violently ripping away whatever tiny fragments of loyalty they had left. The toxic foundation of their fake empire had completely collapsed, burying them all under the heavy rubble of their own staggering greed. I did not stay to watch the rest of the miserable fight. I simply turned around, walked out of the ballroom, and headed toward the basement to pack my bags. I did not have much to take. Over the years, I had deliberately kept my physical footprint in that massive house as small as possible to perfectly maintain my facade. I packed my encrypted laptop, a few changes of comfortable clothes, and the heavy black leather binder that contained the legal documents guaranteeing my absolute freedom. Everything else, the cheap desk, the uncomfortable bed, the fake data entry workstation, could simply be left behind to rot with the rest of the foreclosed estate. I slept better that night than I had in 10 years, surrounded by the quiet, peaceful hum of my air conditioner, while the rest of the house suffocated in dark, humid despair directly above me. The next morning arrived with a heavy, unrelenting torrential downpour. It was as if the sky itself had decided to aggressively wash away the last remaining traces of my family's toxic, fraudulent existence. At 7 in the morning, the harsh grinding gears of an old rusted vehicle echoed through the wet driveway. I grabbed my single canvas duffel bag, slung it over my shoulder, and walked slowly up the dark wooden stairs. I stood by the massive front window in the grand foyer to watch the final miserable act of their pathetic play. A severely dented, brightly painted budget U-Haul truck was parked awkwardly on the wet concrete. It was sitting exactly in the spot where Terrence used to proudly park his repossessed luxury SUV. The massive oak front doors were propped wide open, letting the cold, damp morning air completely flood the dark hallway. Richard and Terrence were trudging back and forth through the heavy rain, their expensive leather shoes sinking deep into the muddy lawn. They were not carrying pristine designer luggage. Because Vanessa had pawned her luxury bags for bail money, and Patricia's premium credit cards were permanently frozen by the federal auditors, they were forced to pack whatever cheap, legally owned clothing they had left into heavy-duty black plastic trash bags. They looked absolutely pathetic. Richard was completely soaked, his gray hair plastered flat to his forehead, silently heaving heavy garbage bags into the back of the dirty rented truck. Patricia and Vanessa stood shivering on the covered porch, wearing plain sweatpants and old wrinkled raincoats. Patricia was tightly clutching a cheap plastic makeup case against her chest. her eyes completely vacant, red and swollen from crying all night. They were quietly arguing, their voices sharp and intensely bitter, blaming each other for the fact that the absolute cheapest budget motel on the dangerous edge of the city was the only place that would accept cash without running a background credit check. The federal investigators had already officially frozen their remaining personal checking accounts at the stroke of midnight. I pushed the front screen door open and stepped out onto the porch. The loud, rhythmic sound of the heavy rain hitting the concrete drowned out my footsteps, but they all turned to look at me anyway. The sheer burning resentment in their eyes was completely palpable, but it was entirely overshadowed by their total crushing defeat. None of them said a single word. They did not apologize for the decade of psychological abuse. They did not beg for a last-minute financial reprieve. They finally understood that my bank vault was permanently sealed and the locks had been changed. I walked right past them without a second glance. I stepped out into the rain, feeling the cool water hit my face, and pulled the heavy oak doors shut behind me. I inserted the master key into the brass lock and turned it, listening to the heavy deadbolt slide into place with a loud, satisfying click. I was not going to keep the sprawling colonial estate. The walls held far too many terrible memories, too much toxicity, and too much fake superiority. I had already signed the commercial demolition permits earlier that week. In exactly 10 days, heavy bulldozers were going to level the entire property completely to the ground. My corporate holding company was going to redevelop the massive lot into a complex of modern, affordable townhomes. The physical monument to their massive greed was going to be entirely erased from the neighborhood forever. As I walked down the wet driveway, walking right past the rusted U-Haul truck, a long, sleek, perfectly polished black Maybach pulled smoothly up to the curb. A uniformed chauffeur immediately stepped out into the storm, opening a large black umbrella to shield me from the heavy downpour. He respectfully opened the heavy rear door, revealing a pristine, luxurious leather interior that made Terrence's lost Porsche look like a cheap plastic toy. I stopped for one brief second and looked back at my family. They were standing ankle-deep in the mud next to a pile of wet garbage bags completely soaked, staring at my chauffeured vehicle with their mouths hanging wide open. The absolute staggering contrast between my new reality and their self-inflicted ruin was the final perfect image I would ever have of them. I climbed into the comfortable back seat of the Maybach, and the chauffeur closed the heavy door, completely silencing the sound of the pouring rain and shutting out their miserable existence forever. As the car pulled smoothly away from the curb, gliding silently down the wealthy suburban street, I poured myself a sparkling water from the chilled center console and leaned my head back against the soft leather headrest. I watched the pristine neighborhood roll by through the heavily tinted windows, reflecting on the massive, suffocating burden I had just completely shed. For 10 years, I had allowed societal expectations and biological guilt to violently dictate my personal boundaries. I had foolishly believed that because we shared the exact same blood, I somehow owed them my financial protection and my emotional sanity. But as I watched their old house disappear in the rearview mirror, I finally understood the ultimate truth about setting boundaries. Cutting off a toxic family is never a tragedy. It is an absolute birthright. You do not owe your life, your hard-earned success, or your mental peace to people who actively plot your destruction behind your back while smiling in your face. The Maybach merged onto the highway, heading toward my massive, quiet penthouse in the heart of the city, taking me toward a completely authentic, incredibly peaceful new life. When the people who are supposed to love you only love what you can buy them, the best investment you can make is walking away. Have you ever had to bankrupt a toxic family member's ego? Tell me your story.